Confirmation bias is a pervasive cognitive tendency in which individuals favor information that reinforces their existing beliefs and values, while disregarding or undervaluing evidence that contradicts them, a phenomenon that shapes our perception, decision-making, and even the way we interact with the world around us. This bias operates subtly yet powerfully in our daily lives by influencing the way we search for, interpret, and remember information. When we encounter new ideas or data, our minds are inclined to selectively process those details that align with what we already believe to be true, often creating a self-reinforcing cycle that can be difficult to break. For instance, when someone holds a particular political or social view, they may seek out news sources and communities that echo their opinions, inadvertently insulating themselves from alternative perspectives and creating an echo chamber. This selective exposure not only intensifies existing beliefs, but can also lead to polarized views and a fragmented understanding of complex issues. At its core, confirmation bias is deeply rooted in our psychological need for consistency and stability, and it is linked to the concept of cognitive dissonance, the discomfort that arises when we are faced with conflicting information. In order to alleviate this internal tension, our minds often default to strategies that maintain our current worldview, which can include dismissing or rationalizing away contradictory evidence rather than engaging with it critically. The influence of confirmation bias is evident in a wide array of contexts, from everyday decision-making and personal relationships to professional environments and scientific research. In the realm of interpersonal relationships, for example, this bias may cause individuals to focus on behaviors and actions that confirm their initial impressions of others, thereby reinforcing stereotypes or preconceptions, while ignoring evidence that might suggest a more nuanced or different picture. In professional settings, confirmation bias can lead to inefficiencies in decision-making and problem-solving, as teams might overlook alternative solutions in favor of those that seem to support an already favored course of action, ultimately stifling creativity and innovation. In scientific research, the impact of confirmation bias can be even more significant, potentially skewing the design of experiments, the interpretation of data, and the reporting of results. Researchers who are deeply invested in a particular hypothesis may unconsciously favor data that supports their theory and discount findings that challenge it, a tendency that can impede scientific progress and the development of new knowledge. Similarly, in the realm of politics and public policy, confirmation bias contributes to the persistence of partisan divides, as individuals tend to consume media that aligns with their ideological beliefs, while dismissing alternative viewpoints as unreliable or biased. This selective exposure not only reinforces existing opinions, but also makes it difficult for meaningful dialogue and compromise to take place, as each side becomes more entrenched in its own perspective. Overcoming confirmation bias requires a conscious effort to engage with a broader range of information and viewpoints. One effective strategy is to actively seek out sources that challenge one's beliefs and to critically evaluate the evidence presented, regardless of whether it confirms or contradicts existing views. By deliberately exposing oneself to diverse perspectives and questioning the assumptions underlying one's opinions, it becomes possible to break free from the narrow confines of confirmation bias and develop a more balanced, nuanced understanding of complex issues. This process is not without its challenges, however, as it requires both intellectual humility and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. In practice, overcoming confirmation bias might involve engaging in thoughtful debates with individuals who hold different views, reading books or articles that offer alternative explanations, or even reflecting on past decisions to identify instances where biased thinking may have influenced the outcome. It is also important to cultivate an awareness of the ways in which digital media and social networks can exacerbate this bias, as algorithms often curate content in a manner that reinforces existing preferences and further isolates individuals from opposing viewpoints. The significance of addressing confirmation bias extends beyond personal growth, as it plays a crucial role in shaping public discourse and the collective understanding of societal issues. In an era where misinformation can spread rapidly and echo chambers are increasingly prevalent, the ability to critically assess information and remain open to new ideas is essential for fostering informed, constructive discussions. By acknowledging and actively working to mitigate the effects of confirmation bias, both individuals and communities can contribute to a more inclusive and evidence-based dialogue, ultimately leading to better decision-making and a more resilient society. In summary, confirmation bias is a fundamental aspect of human cognition that influences how we perceive and process information, often leading us to favor data that reinforces our pre-existing beliefs while ignoring or downplaying contradictory evidence. Recognizing this bias and taking deliberate steps to counteract it is vital for personal development, effective communication, and the advancement of knowledge across all areas of life. Anchoring bias is a cognitive phenomenon in which the initial piece of information we encounter about a subject, often completely arbitrary, serves as a reference point that significantly influences all subsequent judgments and decisions, even when that original number or idea has little to no relevance to the matter at hand. When we first receive a piece of data, our minds latch onto it and use it as an anchor for interpreting later information, causing our final assessments to be biased toward that original value. This effect was famously demonstrated in experiments where participants were asked to estimate quantities such as the percentage of African nations in the United Nations after being exposed to a random number. Even when the number was clearly arbitrary, the participants' estimates gravitated toward it, highlighting how difficult it is for our minds to disregard initial impressions, even when we know they might be misleading. In everyday life, the influence of anchoring bias is pervasive and can be observed in a variety of contexts. For example, when shopping for a car, if the first vehicle you see is priced very high, that high price becomes an anchor against which you measure all subsequent prices, making even moderately expensive cars seem like bargains. Similarly, in salary negotiations, the first number mentioned, whether by an employer or a job candidate, tends to set the tone for the entire negotiation, as both sides subconsciously adjust their expectations relative to that starting point. This bias is not limited to monetary or numerical decisions. It also plays a role in our perceptions of quality, risk, and even time management. When planning a project, for instance, an initial estimate of how long a task will take often shapes all future estimates, sometimes leading to schedules that are either overly optimistic or unnecessarily prolonged. What makes anchoring bias particularly insidious is that the adjustment from the anchor is typically insufficient. Once our minds have settled on that initial value, even conscious efforts to correct for it rarely move us far enough away, resulting in a persistent distortion of our judgments. Our cognitive processes are designed to simplify complex decision-making by relying on mental shortcuts or heuristics, which help us manage the vast amount of information we encounter daily. While these heuristics are generally useful, they can also lead us astray. In the case of anchoring, the heuristic enables us to make decisions quickly by using a familiar reference point, rather than re-evaluating every piece of new data from scratch. This efficiency comes at the cost of precision, often leading to suboptimal outcomes in professional, financial, and personal settings. In the realm of investing, for example, anchoring bias can cause traders to cling to an initial price of a stock, influencing them to undervalue or overvalue the asset based on past performance rather than current market conditions. In healthcare, doctors might base their diagnoses heavily on a patient's initial symptoms or a preliminary test result, potentially overlooking additional information that could lead to a more accurate assessment. These examples underscore the broad impact of anchoring bias and highlight the importance of being aware of its influence. Overcoming anchoring bias requires a conscious effort to seek out independent sources of information and to deliberately question the initial reference points that come to mind. One effective strategy is to generate multiple estimates before encountering any external numbers, thereby reducing the risk of being unduly swayed by an arbitrary anchor. Another approach involves actively considering alternative scenarios and reflecting on how the initial information might be misleading. In negotiation settings, both parties benefit from conducting independent research so that the figures discussed are informed by objective data rather than merely by the first number presented. Organizations can also play a role by implementing training programs designed to increase awareness of cognitive biases among employees. Such training helps individuals recognize when their initial impressions might be skewing their decisions, enabling them to recalibrate their judgments accordingly. While it may not be possible to eliminate the bias entirely, a conscious effort to challenge first impressions and to gather a broader range of data can lead to more balanced and informed decisions. Ultimately, anchoring bias is a natural byproduct of our reliance on mental shortcuts. Recognizing its presence is the first step toward mitigating its effects. By understanding how our initial perceptions shape subsequent judgments, we become better equipped to question those first impressions, adjust our decision-making processes, and strive for outcomes that are more rational and less distorted. Whether in personal finance, professional negotiations, or everyday choices, being mindful of anchoring bias can help lead to more thoughtful and accurate decisions. The availability heuristic is a mental shortcut our brains use to make decisions quickly by relying on the ease with which examples or experiences come to mind. In other words, when we are asked to estimate the likelihood or frequency of an event, we tend to base our judgment on how readily we can recall similar instances. This process can be both helpful and misleading, as our memories are influenced by factors like recency, vividness, and emotional impact, rather than objective probability. One of the most common examples of the availability heuristic is the way people often overestimate the risk of dramatic events. For instance, after watching extensive media coverage of a plane crash, many individuals might come to believe that air travel is extremely dangerous, even though statistically, flying is much safer than driving. The vivid images and intense emotions associated with the crash make the event more memorable, which in turn causes it to loom larger in our minds than more common but less sensational events, like car accidents. This bias is not limited to risk assessment in transportation. It also affects how we view other threats, such as the likelihood of terrorist attacks or rare diseases, simply because these events are widely reported and leave a strong impression. Research in cognitive psychology has demonstrated that the availability heuristic can lead to systematic errors in judgment. Classic experiments have shown that when people are asked whether there are more words in the English language that start with a certain letter or have that letter in the third position, they often give incorrect answers based on which examples are easier to recall. For example, many people might think there are more words beginning with the letter kig, because it is easier to bring to mind words like kangaroo or kitchen. However, a more thorough analysis reveals that words with K in the third position are actually more common. Such experiments highlight how our judgments can be skewed simply by the relative ease of retrieving information from memory. In everyday life, the availability heuristic shapes our perceptions in many subtle ways. When deciding whether to buy a lottery ticket, for example, people might overestimate their chances of winning if they can easily recall a few highly publicized stories of jackpot winners. The news and media tend to spotlight these extraordinary wins, making them more available in our memory, even though the actual probability of winning is extremely low. Similarly, after hearing about a local crime spree or a series of natural disasters, individuals may believe that such events are more frequent than they really are, which can lead to unnecessary fear and even changes in behavior, such as avoiding travel or investing in excessive insurance coverage. The effects of the availability heuristic extend into professional and social contexts as well. In the workplace, for instance, managers may form judgments about employee performance based on recent events that stand out, rather than on a comprehensive review of past performance. If an employee makes a noticeable mistake shortly before an evaluation, that error can disproportionately affect the manager's overall assessment, even if the employee has been consistently reliable over a long period. This can lead to skewed performance reviews and may influence decisions about promotions or job assignments. In the realm of hiring, interviewers might also rely on memorable first impressions rather than a balanced consideration of all candidates' qualifications, favoring those who make a striking or unusual impact, even if such impressions are not representative of long-term performance. Beyond professional settings, the availability heuristic also plays a role in how we perceive social issues and form opinions about the world around us. Media coverage of extreme events, such as mass shootings or political scandals, can create a distorted view of reality. When these events are repeatedly featured in news reports, they become more accessible in our memory, leading us to overestimate their frequency and impact. This, in turn, can influence public opinion, shape policy debates, and even affect the allocation of resources. For example, an overemphasis on sensational crimes may lead to calls for stricter law enforcement policies, even if the overall crime rate is low or declining. To mitigate the negative effects of the availability heuristic, it is important to actively seek out additional sources of information and to slow down the decision-making process. Rather than relying solely on the first examples that come to mind, one should consider statistical data and broader trends that offer a more accurate picture of reality. This might involve consulting objective reports, historical data, or expert opinions to counterbalance the influence of vivid, memorable instances. Additionally, being aware of this cognitive bias can help individuals recognize when their judgments may be overly influenced by recent events or dramatic examples, prompting them to take a more deliberate and balanced approach. In conclusion, while the availability heuristic allows us to make rapid decisions in a complex world, it also leaves us vulnerable to biases that can distort our understanding of risk and frequency. Whether in personal decisions, workplace evaluations, or public policy, the ease with which certain memories are recalled can lead us to overestimate the likelihood of dramatic events and underestimate more common occurrences. By acknowledging the limitations of our memory and actively seeking out more comprehensive information, we can improve our decision-making processes and avoid the pitfalls of this pervasive cognitive bias. The hindsight bias is a powerful cognitive phenomenon that makes past events appear far more predictable than they actually were. When we look back on an event, whether it was a major decision, a sports game, or a personal setback, our mind reshapes our memory so that the outcome seems inevitable. We tend to think that we knew it all along, even though the situation was filled with uncertainty before the event unfolded. At its core, hindsight bias works by filtering our memories through the lens of what we now know. Before an event happens, there are countless possible outcomes, and our minds consider a range of possibilities. Once the outcome is revealed, however, our memory reconstructs the earlier moments in a way that aligns with that result. This reconstruction makes it seem as if we had foreseen the outcome all along, even though our initial judgment was much less certain. This bias not only distorts our recollection of past events, but also affects how we evaluate our own decision-making abilities. In everyday life, hindsight bias can lead to overconfidence. For instance, after a team loses a tightly contested game, fans and coaches may claim they knew the team would lose, believing that the warning signs were obvious. This overconfidence can be dangerous because it makes us believe that we have a special ability to predict the future, even when the outcome was actually unpredictable. When we overestimate our foresight, we might not learn from our mistakes. Instead of carefully analyzing what went wrong or why the outcome occurred, we dismiss the complexity of the situation, thinking that the result was inevitable. Hindsight bias also influences how we judge the decisions of others. In a workplace setting, if a project fails, colleagues might look back and criticize the choices made, insisting that the failure was obvious. This can lead to unfair blame and prevent a fair assessment of the decision-making process at the time. In legal contexts, for example, jurors might judge a professional, such as a doctor, more harshly after a negative outcome, because knowing what happened makes it seem as if the error should have been predicted. Such retrospective judgment often overlooks the challenges and uncertainties that existed at the moment the decision was made. The bias can affect our personal relationships as well. Imagine a situation where a couple breaks up after months of subtle disagreements. After the breakup, one partner might say, "I knew it was coming," convinced that the signs were crystal clear. In reality, while some behaviors might have hinted at trouble, the breakup was not an inevitable conclusion at the time. By distorting our memory, hindsight bias not only makes us feel more confident in our judgment, but also blinds us to the nuances and complexities that really shaped the situation. One of the significant challenges posed by hindsight bias is that it prevents us from learning from our experiences. If we believe that the outcome was obvious all along, we are less likely to reflect on our initial judgments and analyze why our predictions were off. This lack of critical self-reflection can lead to a cycle of repeated mistakes because we fail to recognize the uncertainty that we once faced. When we ignore the genuine ambiguity of past situations, we set ourselves up for overconfidence in future decisions, making us vulnerable to taking on risks that we might otherwise avoid. Reducing the impact of hindsight bias involves several practical strategies. One effective method is to keep a decision journal. By documenting your predictions and the reasoning behind your decisions before outcomes are known, you create a record that reflects your true level of uncertainty at the time. Reviewing these entries later can reveal just how much your memory has shifted after the fact. This practice not only helps in acknowledging the bias, but also serves as a tool for improving future decision-making. Another useful approach is to consciously consider alternative outcomes. Before finalizing your judgment or decision, take a moment to ask yourself, what else could have happened? This kind of deliberate counterfactual thinking forces you to confront the inherent uncertainty of the situation. By imagining different scenarios and outcomes, you remind yourself that the result was never a foregone conclusion. This method not only weakens the pull of hindsight bias, but also enriches your understanding of the factors that contributed to the outcome. In professional settings, especially in high-stakes environments like healthcare, finance, or law, training programs can be designed to make individuals aware of hindsight bias. By learning about this bias, professionals can better appreciate the complexity of decision-making under uncertainty and become more cautious in their evaluations. For instance, in medical cases, if practitioners and jurors understand that knowing the outcome can distort the perception of a doctor's decisions, they can adjust their judgments accordingly, leading to fairer assessments and better learning from past cases. Ultimately, while hindsight bias is an inevitable aspect of human cognition, helping us create a coherent narrative of our past, it also has the potential to mislead us and impede our growth. By recognizing that our memories are not infallible records of what we originally thought, but are instead reconstructed to fit what eventually happened, we can take steps to counteract its effects. Through practices such as keeping decision journals, actively considering alternative outcomes, and seeking out feedback, we can cultivate a more balanced and realistic perspective on our past decisions. The self-serving bias is the tendency to attribute our successes to internal qualities, while blaming failures on external factors. This bias acts as a protective mechanism for our self-esteem by allowing us to take credit for positive outcomes and to shield ourselves from the negative feelings associated with mistakes or setbacks. When things go well, we see it as a result of our hard work, intelligence, or talent. But when things go wrong, we are more likely to point to bad luck, unfavorable circumstances, or even the actions of others. In this way, the self-serving bias helps maintain a positive self-image even in the face of adversity. In everyday life, this bias can manifest in many ways. Imagine a student who aces an exam. They might believe that their success is solely due to their own diligent study and natural aptitude. However, if the same student performs poorly on another test, they might blame the difficulty of the questions, an unfair teacher, or simply a bad day, rather than recognizing any shortcomings in their own preparation. In the workplace, an employee who secures a big contract may attribute it to their negotiation skills and persistence, while any lost deals are quickly attributed to market conditions or poor timing. This selective attribution reinforces our self-confidence, but it also creates a skewed view of our true abilities. This bias isn't just about protecting our self-esteem, it also influences how we interact with others. When we consistently credit ourselves for good outcomes and deflect blame for failures, it can lead to strained relationships, both in personal and professional settings. Colleagues or friends might feel that we are unwilling to acknowledge our mistakes, or they may perceive our praise as arrogance. Over time, this can create a disconnect where constructive feedback is ignored, and learning from our failures becomes more challenging. The self-serving bias can hinder personal growth because it discourages honest self-reflection and the recognition of areas in which we could improve. Moreover, the self-serving bias can lead to overconfidence in decision-making. Believing that we are inherently more competent than we might be in reality, we risk taking on challenges without adequate preparation or ignoring valuable feedback that could help us perform better. In situations where teamwork is essential, such as in group projects or business ventures, this bias might result in conflicts if team members perceive that one person is consistently over-claiming credit or deflecting responsibility. When everyone is trying to preserve their self-image, it can be difficult to have honest discussions about mistakes or ways to improve, leading to an environment where errors are repeated and learning is stifled. Understanding the self-serving bias also means recognizing its double-edged nature. While it can help protect us emotionally and keep us motivated, it also makes it harder to learn from our experiences. If we attribute all positive outcomes solely to our own efforts, we might neglect the role that external factors played in our success. Conversely, by blaming failures entirely on external circumstances, we may miss opportunities for personal improvement. This unbalanced perspective can result in an inaccurate assessment of our performance and abilities, leaving us ill-prepared for future challenges. Reducing the impact of the self-serving bias involves a conscious effort to adopt a more balanced view of our actions and outcomes. One effective strategy is to seek honest feedback from trusted friends, colleagues, or mentors who can offer a perspective that might be more objective than our own. Another approach is to keep a reflective journal where you note not only your successes, but also the factors that contributed to both your achievements and your setbacks. By documenting the circumstances surrounding each outcome, you can later review your notes to gain a clearer picture of what truly influenced your performance. Additionally, practicing self-compassion and mindfulness can help create a mindset that accepts both strengths and weaknesses as part of the human experience. Recognizing that mistakes are opportunities for growth rather than threats to our self-worth can reduce the defensive need to attribute failures solely to external factors. Over time, this more balanced approach can lead to improved decision-making, better relationships, and a greater willingness to learn from both successes and failures. In summary, the self-serving bias shapes our understanding of our own behavior by letting us claim credit for our successes and avoid responsibility for our failures. While this bias can serve as a useful psychological buffer that protects our self-esteem, it also risks distorting our perception of reality. By fostering self-awareness, seeking objective feedback, and reflecting on the true causes of our outcomes, we can gradually overcome the limitations imposed by this bias. Ultimately, learning to see our experiences in a more balanced way not only helps us grow as individuals, but also improves our interactions with others and our ability to navigate the complexities of life with greater insight. The fundamental attribution error is a common cognitive bias where we tend to overestimate the role of an individual's personal traits and underestimate the influence of situational factors when explaining someone else's behavior. When we observe another person acting in a particular way, say, a colleague snapping at a coworker or a stranger cutting in line, we often jump to the conclusion that their behavior is due to their character, like being rude or inconsiderate, rather than considering the external pressures they might be under. This tendency can have far-reaching effects on our interactions, judgments, and even our relationships. At the heart of this bias is our natural inclination to simplify complex social information. Our brains are constantly bombarded with an immense amount of detail about the people around us. To manage this overload, we rely on mental shortcuts that allow us to quickly form impressions. In doing so, we tend to focus on the behavior itself and attribute it to stable, internal characteristics, largely ignoring the context or circumstances that could have influenced that behavior. For example, if someone cuts you off in traffic, you might immediately think of them as an aggressive driver without considering that they might be responding to an emergency or some other external factor you're unaware of. This error in attribution isn't just limited to everyday annoyances. It can have serious implications in various domains, such as the workplace, education, and even the legal system. In professional environments, managers might overlook external challenges a team member faces, like an unusually high workload or poor communication from other departments, and instead conclude that the employee is simply underperforming. Such misjudgments can lead to unfair evaluations, strained relationships, and missed opportunities for meaningful support. Similarly, in legal contexts, jurors may hold individuals to an unreasonably high standard of behavior because they attribute a mistake solely to personal shortcomings, rather than recognizing how difficult the situation might have been. Another key factor contributing to the fundamental attribution error is that our own behavior is often interpreted differently than that of others. When we act, we tend to see ourselves as victims of circumstances, or as having done the best we could in a given situation. We're aware of the situational pressures and constraints affecting our decisions, so we make allowances for them. However, when we observe others, we lack insight into the external factors influencing them, leading us to jump to conclusions based purely on their actions. This discrepancy not only shapes our interpersonal judgments, but can also breed misunderstanding and conflict, as we might unfairly criticize or judge someone without full knowledge of their situation. The consequences of the fundamental attribution error can be significant. On a personal level, it can hinder our ability to empathize with others, making it difficult to see things from their perspective. This lack of empathy may lead to conflict, isolation, and a breakdown in communication. In broader societal contexts, overemphasizing personal responsibility while discounting external factors can contribute to social divisions and stereotypes, as groups of people may be unfairly labeled based on perceived character flaws. For instance, attributing poverty solely to laziness rather than considering systemic issues like inequality and lack of access to quality education reinforces harmful stereotypes and obscures the real challenges that need addressing. Fortunately, there are ways to counteract the fundamental attribution error. One effective strategy is to consciously consider alternative explanations for others' behavior. Instead of immediately assuming that a person's actions are due to their character, pause and ask yourself what external factors might have contributed to their behavior. This might involve considering stress, cultural differences, or situational pressures that aren't immediately visible. Another useful approach is to gather more context before forming a judgment. Engaging in conversations, asking clarifying questions, and being open to the idea that behavior is often the product of a complex interplay between personal dispositions and external circumstances. Developing empathy is also crucial. By putting yourself in someone else's shoes and trying to imagine the challenges they might be facing, you can gain a more balanced perspective that takes into account both internal and external factors. Over time, practicing this kind of reflective thinking can help reduce our reliance on snap judgments and foster a more nuanced understanding of the people around us. In summary, the fundamental attribution error leads us to overvalue personal characteristics and undervalue situational influences when explaining other people's behavior. This bias not only distorts our perceptions, but also affects our relationships, work environments, and broader societal interactions. By actively seeking to understand the context behind actions, and by cultivating empathy and reflective thinking, we can overcome the pitfalls of this bias, leading to fairer, more accurate judgments and ultimately healthier social interactions. The in-group bias is the natural tendency to favor the people we see as belonging to our own group over those we consider outsiders. When we interact with others, whether in our workplaces, neighborhoods, or even on social media, we are often more inclined to trust, support, and give preferential treatment to those who share similar backgrounds, beliefs, or interests. This bias is deeply rooted in our psychology and has evolved as a way for early humans to create strong social bonds, enhance cooperation, and increase survival. However, while this mechanism can foster group cohesion and loyalty, it can also lead to unfair treatment and discrimination against those who do not belong to our group. At a fundamental level, in-group bias stems from the human need to belong and to form social identities. Our brains quickly sort people into categories, us versus them, based on observable characteristics such as race, language, or even sports team allegiance. Once these categories are established, we tend to view members of our own group as more similar to ourselves, attributing positive qualities like honesty, competence, and kindness to them. Conversely, we might ascribe negative traits or assume that those in outgroups are less trustworthy or capable. This natural categorization simplifies our social world, but it also creates a skewed perspective that can distort our judgment. One clear example of in-group bias can be seen in the realm of sports. Fans of a particular team often display strong loyalty by celebrating wins and forgiving losses in a way that is more lenient than they might be towards rival teams. They will highlight the best qualities of their own team's players while overlooking or rationalizing their mistakes, whereas they are quick to criticize or judge the errors of opponents. Similarly, in a workplace setting, managers may unconsciously favor employees who share similar interests, backgrounds, or work styles, sometimes awarding them more opportunities for advancement or positive feedback, even when other employees may be equally or more deserving. This favoritism can lead to unequal treatment and create divisions within the team. The in-group bias is not always malicious or intended to harm, but its effects can have significant implications. On a personal level, it reinforces our sense of identity and belonging, providing emotional security and a feeling of support from our peers. On a societal level, however, this bias can contribute to prejudice, discrimination, and even conflict between different groups. When people consistently view outsiders through a lens of suspicion or negativity, it deepens social divisions and can lead to systemic inequalities. For example, in diverse societies, in-group bias can manifest as racial or ethnic prejudice, where individuals may favor those from their own background and hold stereotypes against others, even in situations where personal interaction would reveal more complex human qualities. The origins of in-group bias lie in both evolution and social learning. In early human history, belonging to a cohesive group meant better protection from predators, more efficient resource sharing, and increased chances of survival. As a result, our ancestors, who were more attuned to recognizing and favoring their own group members, had a distinct advantage. Over time, this adaptive trait has been passed down and refined through cultural and social influences. Today, while the context has changed dramatically, the underlying impulse remains the same. Our social identities continue to shape our interactions, and the desire to align with a group can sometimes lead us to overlook individual differences and judge people solely based on group membership. Recognizing in-group bias is the first step toward mitigating its negative effects. One strategy is to consciously seek out interactions with people who are different from ourselves. By engaging in meaningful conversations with those from other groups, we challenge our initial assumptions and broaden our understanding of different perspectives. This kind of intergroup contact can help break down the us versus them mentality and reduce prejudice over time. Another approach is to focus on common goals that unite diverse groups. When people work together toward a shared objective, whether in a community project, a business team, or a social cause, the emphasis on individual group differences often diminishes, making it easier to see others as collaborators rather than competitors. In addition to these interpersonal strategies, self-reflection and awareness are crucial. Taking the time to question why we favor certain individuals and whether our judgments are truly fair can lead to more balanced and objective decision-making. For instance, when evaluating someone for a promotion or deciding whom to trust in a new situation, it is helpful to consider all relevant factors, including the context and external circumstances that might be influencing behavior. By deliberately setting aside our automatic tendencies and examining the full picture, we can reduce the likelihood of letting in-group bias skew our perceptions. In summary, the in-group bias is a deeply ingrained human tendency to favor those who belong to our own group. While it can provide a sense of identity and security, it also carries the risk of fostering discrimination and division when applied uncritically. By recognizing this bias and actively working to engage with diverse perspectives, focusing on shared goals and reflecting on our own judgments, we can build more inclusive relationships and make fairer decisions in both our personal lives and society at large. The outgroup homogeneity bias is the tendency to see members of an outgroup as more similar to each other than they really are, while perceiving our own in-group as diverse and multifaceted. In essence, when we look at people who are not part of our own group, we tend to think they're all the same. This bias shapes our social perceptions by making us overlook the individual differences within groups that we consider other. Instead of recognizing a wide range of personalities, opinions, and behaviors among out-group members, we simplify and generalize, often stereotyping them based on a few prominent features. This bias stems from our natural cognitive drive to simplify the social world. Our brains, constantly trying to manage the vast amount of information we encounter, use shortcuts to categorize people into groups. When we classify someone as a member of an out-group, we often rely on a few easily noticeable traits. These traits then become the basis for our generalization. In contrast, we have richer, more detailed knowledge about those within our own group because we interact with them more frequently and observe them in a variety of contexts. This familiarity leads us to see our in-group as diverse and unique, while our understanding of the out-group is based on limited, often biased, snapshots. For example, consider how people sometimes say that individuals of a different nationality all think alike, or that members of a particular political party share the same opinions, even though, in reality, there is a wide range of beliefs and behaviors within those groups. This bias is not just an abstract concept. It has tangible consequences in everyday life. It can lead to miscommunication, reduce empathy, and even fuel conflict, as people are less likely to appreciate the individual differences that exist among those who are not like them. In the workplace, the out-group homogeneity bias can manifest when employees favor colleagues with whom they share a background or cultural similarities, while overlooking the contributions of those from different backgrounds. Managers might unconsciously attribute the success of their in-group to varied talents and hard work, while dismissing the out-group as lacking distinctive qualities. This can result in unequal opportunities, skewed performance evaluations, and a workplace culture that values sameness over diversity. Socially, this bias contributes to the persistence of stereotypes and prejudices. When we see members of an out-group as a monolithic entity, we are more likely to form and reinforce negative stereotypes. These stereotypes can be self-fulfilling as they shape our interactions and expectations. For instance, if someone believes that all people from a certain community are untrustworthy, they may behave with undue suspicion or hostility toward individuals from that community, which in turn can lead to strained relations and further reinforce the stereotype. Reducing the impact of out-group homogeneity bias involves several conscious strategies. One effective approach is to actively seek out interactions with individuals from groups different from our own. By engaging in meaningful conversations and learning about their personal experiences, we can begin to see the diversity within the out-group. This exposure not only humanizes those we once viewed as all the same, but also helps break down the automatic assumptions that come with categorization. Another strategy is to challenge our initial assumptions by reminding ourselves that our perceptions are based on limited information. Taking the time to consider alternative explanations for behaviors we observe can open our minds to the complexity of human diversity. For example, if you catch yourself making a quick judgment about someone from an out-group, pause and ask, what might be other reasons for this behavior? This simple act of reflection can help counteract the tendency to overgeneralize. In addition, being aware of our own biases and actively questioning them is essential. Self-reflection practices, such as journaling about your interactions and examining your immediate reactions to people from different groups can increase your awareness of these automatic tendencies. With time, this reflective practice can lead to more balanced and thoughtful judgments, both in personal interactions and in broader social contexts. The out-group homogeneity bias not only affects how we view others, but also shapes our decisions, interactions, and even policies on a larger scale. By understanding that we are prone to oversimplify the diversity of those outside our own group, we can work to counteract this bias through increased exposure, active reflection, and a commitment to understanding the complexity of human behavior. In summary, the out-group homogeneity bias is a mental shortcut that causes us to see those who are not part of our group as more alike than they truly are. This bias can lead to stereotyping, prejudice, and miscommunication, with significant impacts on our social and professional lives. However, by seeking diverse experiences, questioning our assumptions, and reflecting on our interactions, we can overcome this bias and build more inclusive, empathetic relationships. The sunk cost fallacy is the tendency to continue investing in a project or decision because of the resources we've already committed, even when those past investments can't be recovered and the future costs outweigh any potential benefits. It's a common trap in both personal and professional life that leads us to stick with losing propositions simply because we don't want to feel that our previous efforts or money were wasted. Imagine you've spent several hours and a lot of money on a home renovation project that isn't turning out as planned. Instead of cutting your losses, you keep adding to the project, hoping that eventually it will work out. The more you invest, the harder it becomes to step away, even though your initial expenditures shouldn't influence your current decision. What matters now is whether you can expect a positive return on additional investments, not what you've already lost. This fallacy arises because our emotions and cognitive biases intertwine, making us reluctant to abandon something we've invested in. We begin to see the money or time spent as a justification to continue, even when a rational analysis would suggest that moving on is the better option. In essence, we treat past costs as if they were relevant to future decisions, even though they are irrecoverable. The mistake is in allowing our memory of past investments to cloud our judgment about the current situation. The sunk cost fallacy isn't limited to financial decisions. It shows up in relationships, careers, and everyday choices. For example, you might continue watching a movie you're not enjoying simply because you paid for a ticket, or stay in a relationship that isn't working because you've already invested years in it. In each case, the resources already committed create a kind of psychological pressure that makes it difficult to walk away, even when there is little reason to expect improvement. One reason this fallacy is so pervasive is that our brains are wired to avoid waste. In many situations, it makes sense to use past investments as a guide. If you've spent a lot of time learning a skill, it feels logical to continue with it rather than start over. However, the problem occurs when that reasoning is applied even when it's no longer relevant, when the circumstances change, or when the potential for future success becomes unlikely. Clinging to sunk costs only deepens losses. The consequences of falling prey to the sunk cost fallacy can be significant. In business, companies might continue to fund failing projects, pouring more money into initiatives that aren't producing results because they already invested heavily in them. This not only wastes additional resources, but also prevents the organization from shifting focus to more promising opportunities. On a personal level, holding on to sunk costs can lead to stress, frustration, and an inability to learn from past mistakes. Instead of recognizing that a decision was a misstep and moving on, we get caught in a cycle of additional investment and further losses. Overcoming the sunk cost fallacy requires a shift in mindset. The first step is to recognize that past costs are irrelevant to future decisions. It's helpful to ask yourself, if I hadn't already invested in this, would I choose to continue? This question forces you to evaluate the situation based solely on its future merits, rather than on what you've already lost. Developing the habit of making decisions based on forward-looking analysis, what the additional costs and benefits will be, can help break the cycle. Another effective strategy is to set predetermined criteria for ending a project or making a decision. By establishing clear benchmarks before you begin an investment, you can commit in advance to walking away if those criteria aren't met. This way, you reduce the emotional attachment to past investments and create a more objective framework for decision-making. In summary, the sunk cost fallacy leads us to continue investing in a losing endeavor because of the resources we've already committed, even though those investments should have no influence on our future choices. Recognizing that past costs are irrelevant, focusing on future benefits and costs, and setting clear exit strategies are key steps to overcoming this fallacy. By doing so, we can free ourselves from the trap of throwing good money or time and effort after bad, and make decisions that are more aligned with our long-term goals and overall well-being. The halo effect is a cognitive bias in which our overall impression of a person influences our judgments about their specific traits and abilities. When we meet someone for the first time, whether it's at work, in a social setting, or even in a casual encounter, one prominent quality, such as attractiveness, charisma, or even a friendly demeanor, can cast a halo over all other perceptions we form about that person. This means that if we see someone in a positive light at first, we tend to assume they are also intelligent, trustworthy, and capable, even if we have little evidence to support these assumptions. This mental shortcut is rooted in our brain's need to simplify the complex social world around us. Every day, we are bombarded with vast amounts of information about the people we interact with. Rather than laboriously evaluate every individual trait, our minds group traits together and create an overall impression. When one characteristic stands out, say, a warm smile or confident posture, it can unconsciously influence our assessment of many other qualities. For instance, a well-dressed individual might automatically be presumed to be more competent or organized, even in the absence of concrete evidence. In essence, the halo effect helps us quickly categorize and make decisions about people, saving cognitive energy, but it does so at the risk of oversimplification. The implications of the halo effect are significant across various aspects of life. In professional settings, it can lead to biased evaluations in hiring, promotions, and performance reviews. Managers may favor employees who make a good first impression, attributing qualities like leadership and creativity to them without a thorough analysis of their work. This can result in situations where truly talented individuals are overlooked simply because their initial presentation wasn't as striking. Similarly, in academic environments, teachers might rate a student more favorably based on their initial performance or behavior, neglecting the possibility that the student may have off days or that their true potential could be masked by nerves or other factors. In the realm of personal relationships, the halo effect can influence how we perceive our friends, partners, and even strangers. An individual who is perceived as kind or attractive is often assumed to have other positive characteristics, which might lead us to overlook any negative behaviors or flaws. This bias can create unrealistic expectations and even lead to disappointment when the reality of the person's character doesn't match the idealized image formed during initial encounters. On a broader societal level, the halo effect can reinforce stereotypes. For example, if a community leader is seen as highly competent and ethical, people might generalize these qualities to others within that community, regardless of individual differences. One of the challenges with the halo effect is that it can be self-reinforcing. Once an initial positive impression is established, subsequent information is often interpreted in a way that supports that impression, even if it's contradictory. This can lead to overconfidence in our judgments, making it difficult to reassess our opinions when new evidence emerges. In legal settings, for example, jurors might give undue weight to a defendant's positive characteristics if they appear likable, thereby reducing the scrutiny applied to their actions. In contrast, a person who makes a poor first impression may face harsher judgment overall, even if their behavior in a broader context is similar to that of someone who was viewed more favorably at the outset. To mitigate the halo effect, it is important to adopt strategies that encourage more objective evaluations. One practical approach is to actively seek out disconfirming evidence, rather than immediately forming an overall impression based on the first quality that stands out. Consider specific examples that might challenge your initial judgment. Ask yourself, what evidence do I have that contradicts this first impression? This type of reflective thinking helps to balance the influence of the initial positive or negative cue. Another useful strategy is to establish clear, objective criteria for evaluating performance or character, especially in professional or academic settings. When decisions such as hiring or grading rely on standardized benchmarks rather than subjective impressions, the influence of the halo effect can be reduced. For example, using structured interviews or standardized tests can help ensure that all candidates are evaluated on the same measurable qualities, rather than on the overall impression they create. Engaging with diverse perspectives also plays a crucial role in combating the halo effect. When interacting with people from different backgrounds or with different viewpoints, make a conscious effort to appreciate the full range of individual differences rather than grouping them into a single category. By doing so, you can challenge the tendency to generalize based on limited information and develop a more nuanced understanding of others. It's also beneficial to cultivate self-awareness about our own biases. Regular reflection, through journaling or discussions with trusted peers, can help highlight instances where the halo effect may have influenced our decisions. Acknowledging that our first impressions can sometimes mislead us encourages us to pause and reconsider, making us more open to adjusting our views as we gather more information. In summary, the halo effect is a cognitive bias that causes us to let one prominent trait or impression unduly influence our overall judgment of a person. While it serves as an efficient mental shortcut to navigate the complex social world, it also carries the risk of oversimplification, potentially leading to unfair evaluations and reinforced stereotypes. By actively seeking out alternative perspectives, establishing objective evaluation criteria, and fostering self-reflection, we can counteract the influence of the halo effect. Recognizing and addressing this bias not only improves our decision-making and interpersonal judgments, but also contributes to more inclusive and accurate understandings of the people we encounter every day. The bandwagon effect is the phenomenon where people tend to adopt certain behaviors, follow trends, or purchase items simply because many others are doing so. It's as if the popularity of an idea or action creates a kind of social gravity that pulls individuals toward it, regardless of their own initial opinions or knowledge. In other words, when something becomes popular, more people join in, often without critically assessing whether it truly aligns with their own values or needs. This effect is deeply rooted in our social nature. Humans have an inherent desire to belong and be accepted by their peers, and the bandwagon effect plays on that need. When we see a large number of people engaging in a particular behavior, whether it's buying the latest gadget, voting for a political candidate, or even adopting a new fashion trend, we often assume there must be a good reason behind it. This assumption can lead us to conform to the majority opinion, sometimes overriding our individual judgments or preferences. The influence of others becomes a shortcut for decision-making, reducing the cognitive effort needed to evaluate each option independently. The bandwagon effect is not just about following the crowd blindly. It's also about the perceived validation that comes from being part of a majority. When a trend gains momentum, it sends a message that the behavior or idea is socially endorsed and therefore likely to be beneficial or correct. This social proof is a powerful motivator. For instance, in the realm of consumer behavior, we often see products advertised as best-selling or most popular, and these labels can strongly influence our purchasing decisions. The idea is that if so many people have chosen a product, then it must be a wise choice. In politics, the bandwagon effect can have significant implications. When a political candidate gains early support, it can create a self-reinforcing cycle where more voters join in simply because the candidate appears to be the front runner. This can skew public perception and potentially lead to election outcomes where the winning candidate's momentum overshadows a more critical evaluation of their policies or qualifications. Similarly, in social movements, once a particular cause begins to gather support, others are more likely to join, which can lead to rapid growth even if the underlying reasons for support are not deeply examined. The bandwagon effect also manifests in our personal lives and everyday decisions. Think about trends in social media, viral challenges, popular hashtags, or even memes. The rapid spread of these trends often isn't because every individual has thought deeply about them, but rather because the trend is visible everywhere and appears to be the norm. The pressure to participate can be overwhelming, and many join in simply because they see their friends and influencers doing so. However, while the bandwagon effect can sometimes lead to positive outcomes by promoting unity and collective action, it also has its downsides. One major drawback is that it can stifle independent thinking and creativity. When individuals are overly influenced by what everyone else is doing, there's less room for unique ideas or critical analysis. This conformity can lead to groupthink, where the desire for harmony or conformity results in irrational or dysfunctional decision-making processes. For example, in corporate settings, teams might agree on a strategy simply because it's the popular option, even if it's not the best plan of action, which can ultimately harm the organization. Moreover, the bandwagon effect can cause us to overlook alternative perspectives and lead to polarization. If everyone around us is following a certain trend or belief, we may become insulated from dissenting opinions. This can create echo chambers where critical discussion is suppressed and misinformation spreads unchecked. In extreme cases, such polarization can deepen social divides and contribute to conflicts between different groups. To combat the bandwagon effect, it's important to cultivate awareness of our own decision-making processes. One practical strategy is to take a moment to reflect before jumping on the bandwagon. Ask yourself whether you're making a choice based on careful evaluation or simply because many others are doing so. Seeking out diverse viewpoints can also help break the cycle of conformity. Engaging with people who hold different opinions or who come from different backgrounds can provide a broader perspective and help you weigh options more objectively. Another way to resist the bandwagon effect is to focus on your personal values and priorities. Rather than following trends blindly, consider whether a trend aligns with your own goals and beliefs. This introspective approach can empower you to make decisions that are true to yourself, even in the face of strong social pressure. In summary, the bandwagon effect is a powerful social influence that can lead to rapid adoption of behaviors and ideas simply because they are popular. While this effect often helps simplify decision-making by providing social proof, it can also suppress individual critical thinking and lead to uniformity of thought that stifles creativity. By taking the time to reflect on our decisions, seeking diverse opinions, and aligning our choices with our own values, we can overcome the pull of the bandwagon and make more informed, independent decisions in our personal and professional lives. The planning fallacy is a cognitive bias that leads us to underestimate the time, effort, and resources needed to complete tasks, even when we have experience from past projects that suggest otherwise. When we plan an activity, be it a work assignment, a home renovation, or even a simple errand, we tend to focus on the ideal scenario in which everything goes as smoothly as possible. We imagine that we'll encounter minimal interruptions and that we'll be able to work at peak efficiency, so we set deadlines and allocate budgets that are far too optimistic. This bias causes our plans to fall apart when unexpected challenges arise. At the heart of the planning fallacy is our natural tendency toward optimism. Our minds often overlook the likelihood of delays and complications because we are so focused on our intentions and our vision of how things should proceed. We remember the best-case scenarios more vividly than the times when things did not go as planned. In doing so, we neglect the many variables that could slow us down, such as unforeseen technical difficulties, interruptions, or even simple human error. As a result, even when we have encountered similar challenges before, we still believe that the current project will somehow escape those pitfalls. This bias isn't limited to professional or large-scale projects. It affects everyday life as well. Think about the times when you set out to complete a household chore or run a series of errands and found that the simple task took much longer than anticipated. The gap between our estimated and actual time can be frustrating and can lead to a cascade of scheduling issues. In more significant endeavors, like planning a vacation or organizing a major event, the planning fallacy can result in financial losses, stress, and even conflict among team members who are relying on the original, overly optimistic schedule. One major reason behind this bias is that our brains are wired to imagine the best-case scenario. When we create plans, we often focus on the steps we know we have to take without fully considering potential setbacks. We tend to remember past successes and ignore or downplay the challenges that accompanied them. Our memory selectively highlights the parts of an experience that confirm our belief in our abilities, while the inconvenient details fade into the background. This selective recall reinforces our optimism and makes it difficult to adjust our expectations realistically. The consequences of the planning fallacy can be significant. In business, for example, projects can go over budget and miss deadlines, leading to increased costs, strained relationships with clients, and a loss of credibility. In personal life, underestimating the time needed for a task can lead to stress, as well as disappointment when the outcome doesn't meet our expectations. Over time, this pattern can affect our overall productivity and make it challenging to achieve long-term goals. When we consistently underestimate what it takes to get things done, we may also overcommit ourselves, leading to burnout and a sense of chronic time pressure. So, how can we overcome the planning fallacy? A good starting point is to break large tasks into smaller, more manageable components. By estimating the time required for each step individually, you are forced to consider the real-world obstacles that might occur. This bottom-up approach often results in a more realistic overall estimate than when you simply think about the task as a whole. It also helps to add a buffer, extra time or resources, that accounts for the unexpected. Even a small percentage of additional time can make a significant difference when faced with unforeseen complications. Another effective strategy is to draw on past experiences and data. Look back at similar tasks or projects you have completed before and analyze how much time they actually took compared to your initial estimates. This reference class forecasting helps you ground your plans in reality rather than in idealized expectations. It can be useful to keep a record or journal of previous projects, noting the discrepancies between your estimates and the actual outcomes. Over time, you can learn to adjust your planning more accurately. Seeking input from others can also provide a more balanced perspective. When planning a project, discuss your timeline and resource estimates with colleagues or friends who have tackled similar challenges. They may highlight potential pitfalls you haven't considered or offer more realistic estimates based on their own experiences. Collaborative planning not only helps you generate better estimates, but also increases accountability, which can motivate you to stick to a more realistic schedule. Finally, it's important to cultivate a mindset that embraces uncertainty and remains flexible. Recognize that even the best-laid plans can go awry, and that setbacks are part of any complex process. When you build flexibility into your plans, you reduce the pressure to meet unrealistic deadlines and can adapt more easily when things don't go as expected. Regularly reviewing and updating your plans as new information emerges is a practical way to keep your expectations in line with reality. The negativity bias is the tendency to give more weight to negative experiences, emotions, or information than to positive or neutral ones. This bias influences how we remember events, make decisions, and interact with others. When we receive feedback or news, our minds tend to focus more on the adverse aspects, even if they are less frequent than the positive ones. In everyday life, this means that a single criticism can feel far more impactful than multiple compliments, and a negative event is often remembered more vividly than several positive events combined. This bias is thought to have deep evolutionary roots. For early humans, noticing and remembering threats was crucial for survival. Being highly attuned to potential dangers increased the likelihood of avoiding predators, natural hazards, or harmful social situations. Over time, this survival mechanism became hardwired into our cognitive processes. Today, even though our environment is far less dangerous in many ways, the same bias persists. It leads us to focus on what might go wrong rather than on what is going well. The negativity bias affects many aspects of our lives, from personal relationships to professional settings. In social interactions, for example, we might dwell on a single hurtful comment from a friend while overlooking all the times they have been supportive and kind. This skewed perception can lead to misunderstandings and conflicts, as we fail to see the full picture of someone's character. In the workplace, negative feedback or minor setbacks can overshadow achievements. An employee might feel demotivated after a small mistake, ignoring their overall strong performance. This bias can also influence our decision-making processes, leading us to be overly cautious or pessimistic. When planning for the future, we may overestimate the likelihood of negative outcomes, which can result in missed opportunities and a reluctance to take healthy risks. In the realm of media and public perception, negativity bias plays a significant role. News outlets often emphasize negative stories because they capture our attention more effectively. This means that even if the world is experiencing more positive developments, the constant stream of negative news can distort our overall view, making us believe that things are worse than they really are. Social media amplifies this effect, as negative posts or comments tend to generate stronger emotional reactions and more engagement, reinforcing the bias further. Our brain's heightened response to negative information isn't inherently harmful. It can serve as a protective mechanism, but when it becomes disproportionate, it can lead to an unbalanced view of reality. This imbalance can have profound implications for mental health, contributing to stress, anxiety, and even depression. When our thoughts are dominated by a focus on negative events or outcomes, it becomes difficult to appreciate positive experiences, and this can create a cycle of negativity that affects overall well-being. To counteract the negativity bias, it's important to develop strategies that help balance our perception. One effective approach is to practice gratitude. By consciously taking time each day to acknowledge and appreciate positive experiences, we can start to shift our focus away from the negative. Keeping a gratitude journal, where you write down a few things you're thankful for, can be a powerful tool in recalibrating your attention. This practice doesn't ignore negative events, but ensures that they don't overshadow the positives. Another strategy is to actively seek out positive feedback and balanced perspectives. In both personal and professional settings, try to get a comprehensive view rather than focusing on isolated negative incidents. When you receive criticism, pause to reflect on the overall context. Ask yourself if this negative feedback is representative of the bigger picture or just an exception. This balanced reflection can help prevent overgeneralizing based on a few adverse events. It can also be useful to engage in mindfulness and stress reduction practices. Mindfulness meditation, for instance, encourages you to observe your thoughts without judgment. This practice can help you recognize when your mind is fixating on negative aspects and allow you to shift your focus more deliberately to other elements of your experience. By training your attention, you can learn to balance negative information with positive or neutral information, leading to a more realistic outlook. In decision-making scenarios, counteract the bias by considering alternative outcomes. Before making a choice, deliberately list out possible, positive, negative, and neutral outcomes. This exercise forces you to acknowledge that the future isn't predetermined by the worst-case scenario and helps build a more balanced expectation. Additionally, when evaluating past events, try to reconstruct what the situation was like before the outcome was known. Reminding yourself of the uncertainty that existed at the time can help temper the belief that the negative outcome was inevitable. In summary, the negativity bias causes us to focus more on negative information and experiences than on positive ones, a tendency that has deep evolutionary roots but can lead to distorted perceptions in modern life. This bias affects our relationships, decision-making, and overall mental health by magnifying adverse events while downplaying positive ones. By practicing gratitude, seeking balanced perspectives, engaging in mindfulness, and considering alternative outcomes, we can mitigate the impact of negativity bias. Ultimately, becoming aware of this bias and actively working to counterbalance it allows us to maintain a more nuanced and realistic view of our experiences, leading to improved well-being and better decision-making in both our personal and professional lives. The optimism bias is a cognitive tendency where we believe that we are less likely to experience negative events and more likely to achieve positive outcomes compared to others. This bias often leads us to set overly ambitious goals and make plans based on the assumption that everything will go smoothly, even when past experience or objective data suggests that setbacks are common. When we plan for the future, we naturally focus on the best-case scenario. We picture ourselves succeeding, finishing projects on time, and encountering only minor obstacles. This positive vision feels uplifting and motivates us to pursue our goals. However, it also means that we tend to overlook potential challenges, unexpected delays, and the amount of effort that will actually be required. For instance, someone might decide to complete a major project in a week, believing that their current momentum and resources will carry them through, only to find that unforeseen issues push the deadline back significantly. The roots of the optimism bias lie in our need for hope and confidence. Having an optimistic outlook helps us remain resilient in the face of adversity and encourages us to take risks that might lead to significant rewards. In many ways, a dose of optimism is beneficial. It fuels creativity, innovation, and perseverance. However, when this bias becomes too pronounced, it can lead to underestimating risks, making poorly informed decisions, and experiencing repeated disappointments. In personal finance, for example, people may invest in risky ventures because they underestimate the likelihood of loss, while in health, individuals might ignore warning signs or skip preventive measures because they feel invulnerable. One of the striking manifestations of the optimism bias is how it skews our memory and planning processes. When we look back on past events, we often recall our original plans as having been more accurate or more feasible than they actually were. We tend to remember the intentions and the excitement we had at the outset, while minimizing or completely forgetting the obstacles we encountered. This retrospective view reinforces our belief that things should have worked out perfectly, even if they didn't. As a result, we may overestimate our ability to handle similar challenges in the future, which can lead to repeated overcommitment and frustration. In the workplace, The optimism bias can be particularly costly. Project managers and team leaders might promise quick turnarounds or low budgets because they believe that their team will perform flawlessly under ideal conditions. When reality sets in with unexpected hurdles, such as technical difficulties, supply chain disruptions, or even simple miscommunications, the original timeline and budget quickly become unrealistic. This disconnect between expectation and reality can lead to increased stress, reduced morale, and strained relationships with clients and stakeholders. Similarly, in business ventures, entrepreneurs might overestimate the market potential of a product or underestimate the competition, leading to investments that do not pay off as expected. Socially, the optimism bias affects our relationships and personal well-being. Many of us have experienced the disappointment of unmet expectations, whether it's in our careers, relationships, or personal projects. The belief that everything will turn out well can be comforting in the moment, but when reality intrudes, it often leaves us feeling unprepared or disillusioned. Moreover, this bias can also cause us to ignore or rationalize away warning signs in relationships or important life decisions, making it harder to learn from past experiences. So, how can we manage the optimism bias and make more realistic plans? One practical strategy is to adopt a more balanced approach by considering a range of possible outcomes. Instead of focusing solely on the best-case scenario, take time to reflect on what could go wrong as well as what might go right. This kind of pre-mortem analysis can help you build a more realistic picture of your plans. It may also be beneficial to break larger tasks into smaller, manageable steps and to review past projects or experiences to see how your initial estimates compare with actual results. This reference to previous experiences can help ground your expectations in reality. Another useful strategy is to actively seek feedback from others. Discuss your plans and timelines with colleagues, mentors, or friends who have handled similar tasks. They might provide insights into potential obstacles that you might have overlooked and offer more accurate estimates of the time or resources required. Collaborating with others not only brings a variety of perspectives to the table, but also helps to counteract the natural tendency to focus on your own optimistic view. Additionally, it's important to build flexibility into your planning. No plan is set in stone, and circumstances can change rapidly. Allowing for some buffer time or extra resources can alleviate the stress that comes when things don't go exactly as planned. Regularly reviewing your progress and being willing to adjust your plans as new information emerges can prevent the kind of overcommitment that often results from unchecked optimism. In summary, the optimism bias leads us to overestimate our chances for success and underestimate potential obstacles, creating a gap between our expectations and reality. While a positive outlook is essential for motivation and resilience, unchecked optimism can result in poor decision-making and recurring disappointments. By considering a spectrum of possible outcomes, learning from past experiences, seeking external feedback, and maintaining flexibility in our plans, we can counterbalance the bias and make more informed decisions. Recognizing the limits of our foresight ultimately helps us plan better, manage risks more effectively, and achieve more sustainable success in both our personal and professional lives. The status quo bias is a cognitive tendency that leads us to prefer things to remain the same rather than change, even when change might be beneficial. It's the mental inertia that makes us stick with familiar options, often because the current state feels safe and predictable. When we face decisions, whether in our personal lives, at work, or in society at large, we are often more comfortable with the status quo simply because it is known, even if alternatives could offer improvements. The uncertainty and potential risks associated with change make the current situation more appealing. Imagine you're considering whether to switch your bank or upgrade your mobile phone plan. Despite hearing about better deals and more advanced features, you might choose to stick with your current provider because the effort required to learn a new system, set up new accounts, and adjust to different customer service protocols feels overwhelming. This resistance isn't necessarily based on a thorough evaluation of pros and cons. Rather, it's driven by an inherent preference for what is already familiar. Our minds tend to discount the potential benefits of change because the current state is what we know best. This bias often manifests in various aspects of life. In the workplace, employees may be hesitant to adopt new technologies or methodologies because their existing systems have worked for them in the past. Managers might continue to follow traditional processes, even when innovative approaches could streamline operations, simply because change disrupts the comfort of routine. In politics, voters may support policies that maintain the current order, even if there are clear signs that reform could lead to progress, because the risks of change seem more daunting than the possibility of improvement. One key factor fueling the status quo bias is our natural aversion to loss. Change can be perceived as a threat to what we already have, and the fear of losing something familiar, even if the alternative is uncertain, often outweighs the potential gains from making a change. Our decision-making process tends to focus more on avoiding losses than on acquiring gains. This can lead to decisions that favor the maintenance of current conditions, even when a change could lead to better outcomes in the long run. Another contributing element is the discomfort that comes with ambiguity. When faced with a choice, the current state provides a clear, unambiguous option that requires no further learning or adjustment. Change, on the other hand, is inherently uncertain. We may not know exactly how a new option will perform or what challenges it might bring. This uncertainty creates cognitive friction, prompting us to lean toward the familiar simply because it minimizes the mental effort needed to predict the future. The status quo bias also interacts with our self-identity. Often, our current circumstances are closely linked to our sense of self. Whether it's our job, our habits, or even our beliefs, these elements of our identity are reinforced by continuity. Changing them might not only disrupt our routine, but also challenge our self-concept. As a result, we may resist change to protect our identity, even if that resistance leads to missed opportunities for growth or improvement. Overcoming the status quo bias requires a deliberate effort to challenge our default preferences. One effective strategy is to actively evaluate the potential benefits and costs of change. Before deciding to stick with the current state, take a moment to list out the possible advantages of the new option and the disadvantages of maintaining the status quo. This can help counterbalance the emotional comfort that the familiar provides with a more rational assessment of the alternatives. Another approach is to seek external perspectives. Sometimes our attachment to the status quo is so ingrained that we overlook options simply because we're too close to the situation. Talking to someone who is less emotionally invested or who has experience with the alternative can provide valuable insights and help break the cycle of inertia. For example, If you're considering a new approach at work, discussing it with colleagues who have successfully implemented similar changes can boost your confidence in moving away from the old ways. It's also beneficial to experiment with small changes as a way to build confidence in the process of change itself. Instead of overhauling an entire system at once, try implementing a minor adjustment and monitor the results. This gradual approach can reduce the fear of the unknown and demonstrate that change does not necessarily lead to negative outcomes. Over time, as you experience the benefits of small improvements, you may become more open to larger transformations. In conclusion, the status quo bias is a deeply ingrained cognitive preference for the familiar that often leads us to resist change, even when it might be beneficial. This bias is fueled by our natural aversion to loss, the discomfort of uncertainty, and the protective nature of our self-identity. By consciously evaluating the alternatives, seeking external viewpoints, and embracing small, incremental changes, we can overcome this bias. Learning to question our default settings allows us to make more balanced decisions, seize new opportunities, and ultimately foster personal and professional growth. The endowment effect is a well-known cognitive bias where individuals tend to assign a higher value to objects simply because they own them. In other words, once we possess something, whether it's a mug, a piece of furniture, or even an idea, we begin to see it as more valuable than if we were merely considering it for purchase. This phenomenon is not just a quirky observation about human behavior. It has significant implications for how we make economic decisions, negotiate deals, and even how we feel about our personal belongings. At the heart of the endowment effect is the idea of ownership. When we own something, our emotional and psychological connection to that item deepens. It becomes part of our self-identity. For example, imagine being given a coffee mug. Once it's in your hands, you may feel a sense of attachment to it. Later on, if someone offers to buy it from you, you might demand a price that is much higher than what you would have been willing to pay if you had not owned it. This is because the mere fact of ownership creates a subjective value that goes beyond the item's market price or intrinsic utility. This bias can be traced back to our need for self-affirmation and our desire to protect what is already ours. Psychologically, letting go of something we own often feels like a loss, even if the object itself is not particularly valuable. This loss aversion makes us reluctant to part with items, leading us to overvalue them simply because we have them. The endowment effect can be observed in various contexts, from consumers unwilling to sell products they have purchased to investors holding on to stocks that have lost value because they don't want to acknowledge a loss. In everyday life, the endowment effect can influence our decisions in subtle yet impactful ways. Consider personal relationships, or even sentimental items like photographs or heirlooms. We might hold on to these objects and feel they are priceless, even when their monetary value is low. This emotional attachment can affect how we negotiate in both personal and professional settings. For instance, when buying or selling a car, a seller might demand a higher price simply because the vehicle has been in the family for years, while a buyer might not appreciate that same historical or emotional significance. The effect also plays a role in business and marketing strategies. Companies often leverage the endowment effect by offering free trials or samples. Once consumers have the product, even temporarily, they begin to develop a sense of ownership and are more likely to purchase it at a higher price than they would otherwise. This strategy works because the psychological value attached to possessing something can be much greater than the value of an item in the abstract. However, the endowment effect is not without its downsides. In decision-making, it can lead to irrational choices. For instance, entrepreneurs might cling to failing projects because they have invested so much time, money, and emotion into them, a behavior closely related to the sunk cost fallacy. In such cases, the bias prevents them from cutting their losses and moving on to more promising opportunities. Moreover, in negotiations, this bias can hinder compromise, as parties may overvalue their assets simply because they own them, leading to impasses and less efficient outcomes. Understanding the endowment effect is important because it highlights how our subjective experiences can distort objective evaluations. Recognizing that our attachment to possessions can inflate their perceived value is the first step toward more rational decision-making. One strategy to counteract this bias is to step back and evaluate objects or situations from an outsider's perspective. For example, asking yourself, if I didn't own this, what would it be worth? Can help recalibrate your judgment. Additionally, gathering objective data, such as market values or third-party appraisals, can provide a more balanced view, helping you make better informed decisions. In summary, the endowment effect is a powerful cognitive bias where ownership increases perceived value, influencing everything from personal attachments to market behavior. It emerges from our emotional connection to the things we own and our inherent desire to avoid loss. While it can enhance our attachment and satisfaction, it can also lead to irrational choices, overvaluation of assets, and challenges in negotiations. By being aware of this bias and actively seeking objective assessments, we can mitigate its effects and make decisions that better reflect reality rather than our subjective perceptions. The choice-supportive bias is the tendency to remember our choices in a more positive light than they might objectively deserve. Once we make a decision, our minds have a way of distorting our memories so that the option we chose appears better and the options we rejected seem less attractive. This bias helps protect our self-esteem and reduce the cognitive dissonance that can arise when we are faced with the possibility that we may have made a poor choice. It's a subtle yet powerful mechanism that influences how we recall our past decisions and even shapes our future ones. When you choose between two alternatives, whether it's picking a restaurant for dinner, selecting a vacation destination, or even making a major career move, your brain starts to filter and reframe the details of the decision after it has been made. For example, if you decide to dine at a particular restaurant, you may later remember the meal as being exceptionally good, even if it had some mediocre moments. At the same time, you might recall the alternatives as having been less appealing, even if they had their own merits. This selective memory process allows you to feel more confident about your choice and helps to justify the decision you've already committed to. This bias is driven by a mix of emotional and cognitive factors. Emotionally, we want to feel that our decisions reflect our good judgment, and so we tend to remember our choices more favorably. Cognitively, our brain is inclined to reduce the discomfort of regret by downplaying any negative aspects of our chosen option. This means that even if the decision wasn't perfect, or if there were flaws in our reasoning at the time, our memory shifts to emphasize the positives and to minimize the negatives. In doing so, we create a narrative that supports our original choice, reinforcing our belief that it was the right one. The choice-supportive bias can have both positive and negative implications. On one hand, it can help boost our confidence and reinforce our commitment to our decisions. This positive self-reinforcement can be particularly useful in situations where a strong belief in our choice is needed to persevere through challenges. For example, entrepreneurs might cling to their business decisions and continue to invest time and energy in their ventures because they remember the initial choice as having been a strong, well-founded one. This kind of bias can help maintain motivation and drive, even when the path ahead becomes uncertain. On the other hand, this bias can hinder objective decision-making and lead to persistent errors. When we remember our choices too favorably, we may fail to learn from our mistakes because we simply rewrite the story in our minds to make the outcomes seem inevitable. This selective memory can also prevent us from considering alternative options that might have been better, as we become locked into the narrative that supports our original decision. In personal relationships, for instance, a person might overlook red flags in a partner because after committing to the relationship, they choose to focus on the positive qualities and disregard any warning signs. Over time, this can lead to problems that might have been avoided if a more balanced view had been maintained. In the realm of consumer behavior, the choice-supportive bias often explains why people stick with a product or brand even when better alternatives are available. After purchasing an item, consumers might later recall all the reasons why they made that choice, reinforcing their loyalty to the product. This bias can also affect how we evaluate our experiences. If we support our choices too strongly, we might ignore genuine feedback or constructive criticism that could lead to improvements in the future. To counteract the choice-supportive bias, it is important to actively seek out objective feedback and to critically reflect on our decisions. One practical strategy is to keep a decision journal where you record not only what choices you made, but also the reasons behind those decisions and any concerns you had at the time. Reviewing these notes later can provide a more balanced perspective and help you see where your memories might have been distorted. Another approach is to deliberately consider the strengths and weaknesses of all options, both before and after a decision is made. This can be done by listing the pros and cons of each alternative in a structured way. By comparing these lists, you are more likely to notice if you are favoring the option you chose simply because it has become familiar, rather than because it was objectively the best choice. Additionally, discussing your decisions with trusted friends or colleagues can offer fresh perspectives. When others provide honest feedback, it becomes harder for you to cling to a biased narrative that solely supports your choice. Engaging in these discussions encourages a more nuanced evaluation of outcomes, where you recognize both the benefits and the limitations of your decisions. In summary, the choice-supportive bias is a common mental shortcut that leads us to view our past decisions in an overly positive light, while devaluing the alternatives we left behind. This bias can protect our self-esteem and maintain our commitment to our choices, but it also risks blinding us to potential improvements and the lessons that can be learned from less favorable aspects of our decisions. By keeping detailed records of our decision-making process, actively weighing all options, and seeking external feedback, we can work towards a more balanced and realistic appraisal of our choices, ultimately leading to better decisions in the future. The illusion of control is a cognitive bias that makes us believe we have more influence over outcomes than we actually do. When we engage in activities where chance plays a significant role, like gambling, investing, or even planning our daily schedules, we often overestimate our ability to steer events in our favor. This bias is rooted in our deep-seated need for certainty and control. It provides us with comfort by allowing us to feel as though our actions can directly shape our future, even in situations where external factors play a major role. At its core, the illusion of control occurs because our brains naturally focus on the actions we take, ignoring or underestimating the unpredictable elements in our environment. For instance, consider how many people believe that choosing a specific slot machine or following a particular ritual can improve their odds of winning, despite the outcomes being entirely random. This belief not only gives us a false sense of agency, but also encourages us to persist in behaviors that might not actually enhance our chances of success. In everyday life, this can manifest in various ways, from the small rituals we perform to avoid bad luck, to the persistent belief that we can control outcomes in our work or personal lives. The practical implications of the illusion of control are widespread. In business, leaders might make overly optimistic projections or take risks based on the mistaken belief that they can influence market trends or project outcomes through sheer force of will. This can lead to poor planning and overcommitment of resources. Similarly, in personal finance, investors might underestimate risks and overestimate their ability to predict market fluctuations, resulting in decisions that expose them to significant losses. Even in our health decisions, we might believe that our personal habits alone can fend off illnesses, neglecting the role of genetics or environmental factors. One reason this bias is so persistent is that it's reinforced by our emotional responses. Feeling in control is inherently satisfying and can boost our confidence. This positive reinforcement makes it difficult to acknowledge that many outcomes are determined by factors beyond our influence. As a result, when things go well, we attribute success to our actions. But when things go wrong, we often fail to recognize the role of chance or external circumstances. Overcoming the illusion of control requires a shift toward a more realistic evaluation of the factors that influence outcomes. One effective strategy is to systematically analyze past experiences and recognize patterns where outcomes were driven by unpredictable elements rather than personal influence. For example, if you have repeatedly encountered unexpected setbacks despite taking all the right steps, it might be a sign that external factors are at play. A practical exercise is to ask yourself, if I hadn't taken this particular action, would the outcome have been much different? Such reflection can help you detach your self-worth from your ability to control events. Another important strategy is to gather objective data and consider the probabilities based on historical evidence, rather than relying solely on your intuition. When planning a project or making a financial decision, it can be very helpful to look at similar cases and understand the role that chance played in those outcomes. This reference class forecasting allows you to calibrate your expectations more accurately and guard against overconfidence. It's also valuable to seek diverse perspectives. When you're involved in a decision, especially one with high stakes, getting feedback from others can provide a more balanced view. Colleagues, mentors, or experts might point out risks and factors that you've overlooked. Their insights can help you recognize that many outcomes are subject to randomness and that control is often more limited than it appears. In summary, the illusion of control leads us to overestimate our ability to influence outcomes, offering a comforting but often misleading sense of mastery over our lives. While this bias can boost our confidence, it can also result in unrealistic expectations, overcommitment, and poor decision-making. By reflecting on past experiences, grounding decisions in objective data, and seeking external feedback, we can begin to see the limits of our control and make more balanced, informed decisions. Recognizing and mitigating the illusion of control ultimately helps us navigate uncertainty with a clearer, more realistic perspective. The actor-observer bias is a cognitive tendency where we explain our own actions by referring to external circumstances while attributing others' behavior to their internal traits. In other words, when we act, we see our choices as responses to situational factors, stress, time pressure, or social norms, whereas when we observe someone else, we often assume their behavior reflects their character, personality, or inherent disposition. Imagine you're running late for an important meeting. You might justify your tardiness by saying that the traffic was unusually heavy or that unexpected roadwork caused delays. However, if you see a colleague arriving late, you might quickly conclude that they're simply irresponsible or unorganized. This double standard is a clear illustration of the actor-observer bias in action. The bias stems from the fact that we have more insight into our own context and the pressures we face. We know the full story behind our actions, but when it comes to others, we see only their behavior and not the situational factors that might have influenced them. This bias is more than just a quirk of social perception. It affects our interactions and relationships. In personal relationships, for instance, this bias can lead to misunderstandings. When a friend cancels plans, you might think it's because they're being inconsiderate or uncommitted, without considering that they may be dealing with personal stress or an unforeseen emergency. On the other hand, when you cancel plans yourself, you naturally justify it by referring to external circumstances, like an overwhelming workload or family responsibilities. This discrepancy in attribution can create friction and reduce empathy between people, as it prevents us from fully understanding the challenges that others might be facing. In professional settings, the actor-observer bias can influence how managers evaluate their employees. A supervisor might see their own behavior, say a missed deadline, as being caused by factors such as conflicting priorities or resource constraints. However, when an employee misses a deadline, the supervisor might be more likely to attribute it to a lack of motivation or poor time management, rather than considering that the employee might also be facing similar external pressures. This bias can lead to unfair assessments and hinder effective communication and problem-solving in the workplace. The underlying mechanism behind this bias involves differences in perspective and the availability of contextual information. When we're the actors, we have immediate access to the reasons behind our decisions, making it easier to see that our actions were influenced by the situation. In contrast, when we observe someone else, we often have a limited view of their circumstances and are left to fill in the gaps with assumptions about their personality or character. Our natural inclination to simplify the complexity of social interactions results in us overemphasizing internal attributions for others, while our own actions remain shielded by the rich context we already know. Overcoming the actor-observer bias begins with awareness, recognizing that this bias exists and that it can distort our interpretations of others' behavior, is the first step. One useful approach is to consciously consider situational factors whenever you're evaluating someone else's actions. Ask yourself, what external pressures might this person be under? Is there more to this story than just their behavior? By doing so, you open yourself up to a more balanced perspective that accounts for both internal and external influences. Another effective strategy is to engage in active empathy. Try to put yourself in the other person's shoes and imagine the circumstances that could have led to their behavior. This not only promotes a more compassionate view, but also helps to counteract the automatic tendency to blame personal traits. In group settings, encouraging open communication about challenges and contextual factors can reduce misunderstandings. When team members share the reasons behind their decisions or delays, it creates an environment where external factors are acknowledged and judgments become more nuanced. In addition, seeking feedback from others can help mitigate the bias. For instance, after observing someone's behavior, discuss your impressions with colleagues or friends who might offer additional context or alternative explanations. These conversations can challenge your initial assumptions and provide a more comprehensive understanding of the situation. In summary, the actor-observer bias leads us to interpret our own actions as being largely driven by situational factors, while we attribute others' actions to their personal traits. This difference in perspective can have a profound impact on our relationships, workplace dynamics, and overall social interactions. By becoming aware of this bias, actively considering situational influences, practicing empathy, and seeking feedback, we can work towards more balanced judgments. Such efforts not only foster better interpersonal understanding, but also create a more supportive and collaborative environment in both our personal and professional lives. The just world hypothesis is the belief that people get what they deserve and deserve what they get. It's a way our minds try to create order and fairness in a chaotic world by assuming that outcomes are not random, but instead the result of individuals' actions or moral qualities. When we observe misfortune or success, this bias makes us inclined to think that there must be a reason behind it, often implying that those who suffer did something to bring it on themselves, while those who thrive earned their rewards through virtuous behavior. This way of thinking can be both comforting and problematic. On one hand, believing in a just world helps us feel secure. It reassures us that if we behave well, good things will happen to us, and it gives a sense of control over our lives. In a world where unpredictability and chaos often reign, this belief can provide hope and motivate us to work hard and make morally sound choices. However, the dark side of the just world hypothesis emerges when it leads us to blame victims for their misfortunes. For example, if someone experiences an accident, rather than recognizing that bad luck or unforeseen circumstances played a role, we might conclude that they must have acted carelessly or made poor decisions that brought the outcome upon themselves. This tendency to find moral reasons behind every outcome can lead to unfair judgments and a lack of empathy. It can cause us to overlook the complex, often uncontrollable factors that contribute to life's events. In social and political contexts, the just world hypothesis might lead us to assume that poverty, illness, or other hardships are solely the result of personal failings, thereby diminishing our willingness to support policies or programs designed to help those in need. This oversimplified view of cause and effect can reinforce stereotypes and deepen social divides, as it ignores the broader systemic or situational factors that often play a critical role. At a personal level, this bias can influence our relationships and self-perception. When we witness someone suffering, our belief in a just world might compel us to search for a reason why they deserve such hardship, even if none exists. This not only leads to victim blaming, but also prevents us from understanding that sometimes bad things happen to good people simply due to chance. When applied to our own experiences, the just world hypothesis can lead us to rationalize our successes and failures in ways that might not be entirely accurate. We may overestimate our control over outcomes, thinking that our hard work alone is responsible for our achievements, and then blame ourselves entirely when things go wrong, ignoring external influences. One of the reasons this bias is so pervasive is that it simplifies the complex nature of life. The world is unpredictable, and outcomes are influenced by a myriad of factors, many of which are beyond individual control. However, accepting this complexity can be unsettling. Believing in a just world gives us a neat narrative. If someone suffers, they must have done something wrong. If they succeed, it must be because of their good actions. This narrative is psychologically appealing because it reassures us that the world is orderly and that our actions matter. Yet, the cost of this comfort is a potential distortion in our judgment and a lack of empathy for those who fall victim to forces they cannot control. To counteract the negative effects of the just world hypothesis, it is important to cultivate awareness of the many factors that contribute to outcomes. One effective approach is to consciously remind yourself that luck and circumstance play significant roles in life. When you encounter a misfortune, take a moment to consider external factors such as economic conditions, accidents, or systemic issues that might have contributed to the event. This broader perspective can help reduce the instinct to blame individuals for outcomes that are largely beyond their control. Another useful strategy is to practice empathy by putting yourself in others' shoes. Try to imagine the full range of circumstances that might have led to a person and situation, rather than jumping to a quick judgment. Engaging with diverse perspectives, whether through conversations, reading about different life experiences, or even volunteering, can broaden your understanding of how complex the interplay between personal actions and external factors really is. In addition, it can be helpful to critically evaluate your own successes and failures. Instead of attributing every success solely to your own virtues, or every failure entirely to personal shortcomings, consider the role that external factors have played. Reflecting on past experiences with a balanced view not only provides a more accurate understanding of events, but also prepares you to face future challenges with humility and resilience. In summary, the just world hypothesis is a powerful bias that leads us to believe the world is fair, where good behavior is rewarded and bad behavior is punished, often at the expense of recognizing the randomness and complexity of life. While this belief can offer comfort and a sense of order, it also paves the way for victim blaming and oversimplified judgments about success and failure. By acknowledging the influence of external factors, practicing empathy, and critically reflecting on our own experiences, we can counteract this bias and develop a more compassionate and realistic view of the world. This balanced perspective not only helps us make fairer judgments about others, but also supports personal growth and resilience in the face of life's inevitable uncertainties. The survivorship bias is the tendency to focus on the winners or survivors of a process while overlooking those who failed or dropped out. This bias distorts our perception of reality because we base our judgments only on the visible successes, ignoring the many instances of failure that never make it into our narratives. When we see stories of successful entrepreneurs, breakthrough companies, or triumphant individuals, it's easy to assume that success is common, or that these outcomes were primarily due to talent and hard work. In reality, there are countless stories of similar efforts that ended in failure, and by not accounting for these, we risk developing an overly optimistic view of what it takes to succeed. In everyday life, survivorship bias can subtly influence our decisions and expectations. For instance, if you read about self-made millionaires, you might conclude that anyone can achieve similar success if they just work hard enough. However, this conclusion ignores the many people who work equally hard but do not reach that level of success due to factors like market conditions, timing, or even sheer luck. In academic and business environments, this bias can lead us to overvalue strategies or methods that appear to work, simply because the only visible examples are the ones that succeeded. We might adopt practices from a few high-profile cases without realizing that many others who used the same approach failed. One clear example is in the world of investing. Often, we hear about investors who made tremendous gains by sticking to a particular strategy. These stories capture our attention and reinforce the idea that the strategy itself is foolproof. Yet, if we looked at the entire pool of investors, we would find that many who followed the same strategy experienced significant losses. By focusing solely on the survivors, we end up with a skewed picture that exaggerates the likelihood of success and underestimates the inherent risks. Survivorship bias also affects how we interpret historical events and personal achievements. In history, the accounts that survive are typically those that are successful or noteworthy. This can lead us to assume that only the victorious or innovative ideas were worth pursuing, while the failures are forgotten. In personal contexts, we might compare ourselves only to those who have succeeded, failing to see that for every success story, there are many more cautionary tales. This selective attention can result in unrealistic expectations and can even contribute to overconfidence in our own abilities. The impact of this bias is significant because it can lead to poor decision-making. When we base our strategies or plans on the assumption that success is more common than it really is, we risk taking on projects with underestimated challenges. For entrepreneurs, this might mean investing in ventures without adequately considering the high rate of failure in their industry. For individuals planning personal goals, it can mean setting overly ambitious targets without a realistic assessment of the obstacles that lie ahead. This not only leads to disappointment, but can also waste valuable time, money, and effort. So, what can we do to counteract the survivorship bias? The first step is awareness, recognizing that our natural tendency is to focus on the success stories and to forget the failures. Once we understand that our perspective might be skewed, we can take steps to gather a more comprehensive view. One effective strategy is to actively seek out information about failures and losses in any given field. Instead of only reading success stories, look for case studies or statistical data that include both successes and failures. This broader perspective can provide a more realistic picture of the risks and challenges involved. Another approach is to engage in critical self-reflection and decision analysis. When evaluating a potential project or decision, consider what you would expect to happen if you were not the one who succeeded. Ask yourself, what would it take for this plan to fail, and how likely are those factors to come into play? By acknowledging the possibility of failure, you can plan contingencies and prepare for unexpected setbacks rather than being caught off guard by them. It's also valuable to benchmark your expectations against historical data. For instance, if you're starting a business, research the failure rates in your industry and consider how your own plan compares to the broader picture. This kind of reference class forecasting helps ground your expectations in reality rather than in an idealized narrative of success. In summary, the survivorship bias leads us to focus on the few who succeed, creating a distorted view that neglects the many who fail. This bias can cause us to overestimate the likelihood of success and underestimate the risks involved, whether we're planning a business venture, setting personal goals, or evaluating historical trends. By actively seeking a balanced view that includes both successes and failures, critically analyzing potential risks, and using historical data to inform our decisions, we can overcome the distortions created by survivorship bias. This more realistic approach not only leads to better decision-making, but also helps us manage our expectations and prepare more effectively for the challenges ahead. The base rate fallacy is a cognitive error in which we ignore or underweight general statistical information, the base rate, in favor of case-specific details when making decisions or judgments. In other words, when evaluating the probability of an event, we often focus on the unique or anecdotal information at hand instead of considering how common or rare that event is in the broader context. This can lead to significantly skewed judgments and decisions. Imagine you're evaluating a medical test result. The test might indicate a positive result for a rare disease, and the result itself feels alarming. However, if you don't take into account the fact that the disease is extremely rare, the base rate, you might overestimate your personal risk. Instead of considering that the overall prevalence of the disease is very low, you focus solely on the test outcome. This misjudgment can lead to unnecessary anxiety or even misguided decisions about further treatments. One classic example of the base rate fallacy occurs in legal or hiring scenarios. When making decisions, people sometimes rely on vivid individual cases or stereotypes rather than on broad statistical evidence. For instance, if a candidate fits a certain stereotype based on a few observable traits, a hiring manager might overestimate the candidate's likelihood of success without considering the overall base rate of success among similar individuals. The error lies in emphasizing the particular details of the case while neglecting the background frequency or probability that the trait or behavior occurs in the general population. This fallacy is not limited to high-stakes decisions. It can also affect everyday thinking. Consider how we make decisions about the safety of certain activities. We might hear a dramatic news story about a plane crash, and despite air travel being statistically very safe, we overestimate the risk because the vivid incident overshadows the base rate of accidents. The result is a warped perception of risk, where isolated examples are given undue weight compared to more reliable statistical data. The underlying problem with the base rate fallacy is that human cognition is naturally drawn to information that is concrete, specific, and emotionally charged. Our minds find it easier to latch onto a dramatic, detailed example rather than abstract statistical data. This tendency is compounded by the way information is presented. A personal story or a striking statistic can capture our attention, while the quiet truth of base rates often remains in the background. Over time, this can lead to a consistent pattern of errors where our judgments are biased toward what we immediately perceive rather than what is statistically likely. The consequences of neglecting base rates can be profound. In business, for example, managers might invest in strategies or projects based on a few success stories, without realizing that statistically, such successes are much rarer. In public policy, decisions that do not account for base rates may lead to misallocation of resources. Funding might be directed toward high-profile problems, while more common, yet less dramatic, issues are ignored. On a personal level, failing to consider base rates can result in poor decisions, such as underestimating risks in health or finance, leading to stress or financial loss. So how can we overcome the base rate fallacy? One effective approach is to consciously incorporate statistical information into our decision-making process. When evaluating a situation, start by asking, what is the overall frequency of this event? Or, how common is this outcome in the general population? This helps anchor your judgment in reality. Additionally, it can be helpful to review past data and trends, rather than relying solely on individual cases or recent experiences. Another strategy is to actively seek out diverse sources of information. Rather than depending on anecdotal evidence, look for empirical data, surveys, or studies that provide a broader context. When you're making a decision, whether it's about a health risk, a business venture, or any other important matter, taking the time to gather and compare statistical evidence can prevent you from overvaluing the exceptional cases that might grab your attention. It's also useful to practice critical thinking by deliberately challenging your initial impressions. When you find yourself drawn to a specific example, remind yourself to ask, does this one case represent the norm, or is it an outlier? This question encourages you to step back and evaluate whether your judgment is being unduly influenced by salient but unrepresentative details. In summary, the base rate fallacy leads us to focus on case-specific information at the expense of general statistical data. This can result in significant misjudgments, whether we are assessing personal risks, making business decisions, or evaluating social phenomena. By consciously incorporating base rate data into our thought processes, seeking out a broader array of information, and challenging our initial impressions, we can mitigate this bias. Recognizing the importance of base rates helps us make more balanced, informed decisions that reflect reality rather than being swayed by dramatic individual examples. The illusory correlation is a cognitive bias that leads us to perceive a relationship between two events or characteristics, even when none exists, or when the relationship is much weaker than we believe. It's the tendency to connect dots where there are none, often because certain pairings stand out in our memory. This bias can shape our perceptions, fuel stereotypes, and even influence our decisions, all by skewing the way we interpret the world around us. Imagine you're watching the news, and you repeatedly hear stories of rare but dramatic crimes committed by individuals from a specific background. Even if the overall crime rate in that community is low, the unusual pairing of the person's group and the criminal act can become highly memorable. Because those examples are so striking, you may begin to assume that there is a strong association between the group and criminal behavior, even though statistically that isn't the case. This is the essence of the illusory correlation. The more distinctive or emotionally charged a pairing is, the more likely our minds are to notice and remember it, creating the impression of a connection where there might be little to none. Our brains rely on shortcuts to process information quickly. In the vast sea of daily data, it's impossible to examine every detail with complete objectivity. Instead, we latch on to what is most salient, what catches our eye or ear. When two features, such as a rare trait and an uncommon behavior, occur together, they tend to stand out against the backdrop of more frequent, less distinctive events. This prominence makes it seem as though these events are linked, even if the occurrence is simply coincidental. Over time, repeated exposure to these vivid pairings reinforces the belief in a strong connection, even though we might be ignoring the many cases where the pairing does not occur. The consequences of this bias are far-reaching. In social contexts, for instance, the illusory correlation can contribute to the formation and maintenance of stereotypes. When a few vivid examples of behavior by members of a certain group are repeatedly highlighted, whether in media, personal anecdotes, or historical narratives, we may start to generalize these characteristics to the entire group. This can lead to unjustified assumptions and negative attitudes that persist despite evidence to the contrary. In the business world, a manager might remember one instance of an employee making a critical error, and because that error stands out, assume that the employee is generally unreliable. Such biased judgments can affect performance reviews, promotions, and team dynamics. The bias also influences how we evaluate our own experiences. Consider a scenario where you invest in a project that ultimately fails. If you focus on a few negative moments, you might conclude that the failure was inevitable, even though the majority of your efforts were sound. Conversely, if you focus on a single unexpected win, you might overestimate your ability to predict success in future endeavors. By misjudging the frequency and significance of events based on their distinctiveness, we set ourselves up for flawed decision-making and unrealistic expectations. One of the challenges with the illusory correlation is that it is deeply rooted in our perception processes. Our minds naturally gravitate toward what is unusual or emotionally engaging. This isn't necessarily a flaw. It can help us quickly identify potential dangers or important signals in our environment. However, when it comes to forming opinions about people, events, or trends, this shortcut can lead us astray. We end up with a skewed understanding because we are more likely to remember and overvalue those rare instances that confirm our emerging beliefs, while overlooking the more common, unremarkable occurrences that might provide a more balanced perspective. Overcoming the illusory correlation starts with awareness. Recognizing that our memories tend to highlight the exceptional while downplaying the ordinary is crucial. One effective approach is to actively seek out comprehensive data rather than relying solely on memorable examples. For instance, when evaluating a trend or making an assessment about a group, take time to look at broad statistics and consider the full range of data available. This helps counterbalance the vivid images or stories that might otherwise dominate your perception. Another strategy is to critically question the associations you notice. When you find yourself linking two characteristics together, ask whether this connection is based on a few exceptional cases or if it truly represents a consistent pattern across a larger dataset. By challenging your initial assumptions, you can reduce the risk of forming inaccurate generalizations and develop a more nuanced view of the world. Finally, engaging with diverse perspectives can be highly beneficial. Talking to people who have different experiences or backgrounds can expose you to alternative viewpoints and remind you that the vivid examples you encounter might not tell the whole story. This broadening of perspective not only reduces the risk of falling into the trap of illusory correlation, but also fosters greater empathy and understanding in social interactions. In summary, the illusory correlation is a cognitive bias that causes us to perceive strong connections between events or characteristics based on the distinctiveness of certain pairings. While this mental shortcut can help us quickly process information, it also leads to overgeneralization and the formation of stereotypes. By being aware of the bias, critically evaluating the evidence, and seeking out a wider range of data and perspectives, we can mitigate its effects and form a more balanced, accurate view of the world. Recognizing and addressing the illusory correlation ultimately allows us to make better informed decisions and improve our interactions with others. The recency bias is a cognitive tendency where we give disproportionate weight to the most recent information we have encountered, often at the expense of older but potentially more relevant data. In other words, when making decisions or judgments, our minds tend to focus on the events, data, or experiences that occurred most recently, which can skew our overall perspective. Imagine you're reviewing a performance report for your team. If the last few weeks have been particularly strong or weak, that recent performance is likely to color your overall evaluation, even if, over the long term, the performance trend has been more moderate. Similarly, after reading the news, the latest headlines often feel more important or indicative of a trend than older reports, even if the situation has been ongoing for a while. This bias can affect both our personal and professional lives, influencing everything from our daily decisions to major strategic choices. One reason the recency bias occurs is that our memory tends to be more vivid and accessible for recent events. Our brains are designed to prioritize new information as it might be most relevant for our immediate environment and future predictions. This makes sense from an evolutionary perspective, as paying attention to recent changes could be crucial for survival. However, in today's complex world, this mechanism can lead us astray when we overemphasize short-term fluctuations instead of considering long-term patterns. In the context of decision-making, the recency bias can lead to several pitfalls. For instance, investors might overreact to the latest market movements, making hasty decisions based on recent gains or losses rather than on comprehensive long-term analyses. A manager evaluating an employee might focus on recent errors or successes, disregarding a broader performance history. Even in everyday life, our judgments of relationships, work performance, or academic achievements can be distorted by what has happened in the immediate past. The consequences of relying too heavily on recent information are significant. When we overvalue the latest events, we might ignore the context provided by earlier data that could offer a more balanced view. This can result in poor planning and decision-making. For example, if a company only considers its recent profits without looking at long-term trends, it might make overly aggressive investments or ignore underlying issues that have been developing over time. Similarly, in personal budgeting, a few months of overspending or underspending might skew our perception of our overall financial health, leading us to make unwise adjustments. The recency bias can also influence our emotional responses. When something negative happens recently, it can disproportionately affect our mood, and decision-making, even if positive events from further in the past are more representative of our overall situation. This can lead to a cycle of pessimism or, conversely, undue optimism if recent experiences have been overly positive. In relationships, for instance, a recent argument may linger in our minds and overshadow a history of positive interactions, affecting how we perceive and respond to our partner's behavior. To mitigate the effects of recency bias, it's important to develop strategies that help us balance recent information with a broader perspective. One effective approach is to take time to review historical data or long-term trends before making important decisions. Instead of relying solely on what has happened in the last few days or weeks, ask yourself, how does this fit into the bigger picture? This helps you contextualize the recent events and prevents them from having an outsized influence. Another strategy is to practice reflective thinking. Keeping a record or journal of significant events and decisions over time can help you see patterns and trends that might be missed when you only focus on the latest happenings. When you look back over these records, you can compare your current perceptions with your past experiences, which can provide valuable insights into whether your judgments are being swayed too heavily by recent events. Additionally, seeking diverse perspectives is crucial. Discussing your decisions or observations with others can provide a counterbalance to your own recent experiences. Colleagues, mentors, or friends might have insights based on longer-term trends or different experiences that can help you correct for any bias toward recent information. In group decision-making settings, this collective input can lead to more balanced and well-rounded judgments. Another useful technique is to deliberately set aside a cooling-off period before making decisions that might be influenced by very recent events. For example, if you're feeling particularly affected by a recent setback, give yourself a day or two to reflect and gather additional information before deciding on your next steps. This waiting period can help diminish the emotional intensity of recent events and allow you to approach the situation with a clearer, more balanced mindset. In summary, the recency bias is a cognitive shortcut that leads us to overvalue the most recent information when making decisions or forming judgments. While it is a natural and sometimes adaptive mechanism that keeps us alert to immediate changes, it can also distort our understanding by neglecting the broader context provided by older data. This bias can influence everything from financial decisions and performance evaluations to our emotional responses and interpersonal relationships. By taking a deliberate approach, reviewing long-term trends, engaging in reflective journaling, seeking external perspectives, and allowing a cooling-off period before making critical decisions, we can counteract the influence of recency bias and achieve a more balanced, informed view of our experiences and the world around us. The primacy effect is a cognitive bias that causes the information we encounter first to have a disproportionate influence on our perceptions, judgments, and memories. When we're presented with a list of items, a set of arguments, or even details about a person, the early information tends to stick with us more firmly than what comes later. This effect can be observed in many aspects of our lives, from how we form first impressions in social interactions to the way we remember and prioritize details in a presentation or conversation. One of the key reasons behind the primacy effect is that our brains have limited capacity to process information at any given moment. When we first encounter a set of data, our cognitive resources are fully available. so the initial items get processed deeply and encoded into memory with more attention. As we continue to receive information, our capacity gets gradually overwhelmed, and the later details may not be given the same level of processing. This means that the first impressions we form often act as a kind of mental anchor, influencing our subsequent understanding and decision-making, even if additional information is presented later on. In practical terms, the primacy effect plays a significant role in various contexts. In the world of marketing, for example, the first message a consumer receives about a product can shape their overall perception of it. A well-crafted introduction or first impression can lead to a favorable opinion that colors every subsequent detail, sometimes even overriding contradictory information that comes later. Similarly, in academic or professional settings, the initial points made in an argument or presentation often have a stronger impact on the audience's memory and attitude than later points, making the opening moments critical for effective communication. The impact of this bias is also evident in everyday decision-making. When you meet someone new, the first few minutes of interaction can set the tone for how you view that person. If the first impression is positive, you're more likely to interpret subsequent actions in a favorable light, even if they're neutral or slightly negative. Conversely, a poor initial impression can lead you to overlook redeeming qualities that might emerge later. This dynamic can have lasting effects on relationships, workplace interactions, and even legal judgments, where early impressions of credibility or character can influence outcomes significantly. Another important aspect of the primacy effect is its role in memory recall. Studies show that people tend to remember the first items in a list or the initial details of a story much better than those that follow. This is why students often learn that the first chapters of a textbook are recalled more clearly than later ones, and why job candidates are advised to make strong introductions during interviews. The early information acts as a scaffold for memory, and it often serves as a reference point against which later details are compared or even distorted. Despite its advantages, such as allowing us to quickly form a coherent understanding of new information, the primacy effect can also lead to errors in judgment. Because we rely so heavily on the initial information, we might ignore later evidence that contradicts our first impressions. This can result in biased decisions, particularly in situations where the initial data is incomplete or misleading. For instance, if a news report begins with a sensational detail, the lasting impression may be overly negative, even if subsequent parts of the story provide a more balanced perspective. In such cases, our decision-making might be skewed by the power of that first impression. Overcoming the primacy effect requires deliberate effort and self-awareness. One strategy is to actively seek out and consider additional information, especially if the initial details seem overly simplistic or emotionally charged. Pausing to reflect on whether the first impression truly represents the whole picture can help temper its influence. Another approach is to create structured environments for decision-making, such as checklists or multiple rounds of review, that force a re-examination of initial impressions in light of new data. This method helps ensure that decisions are not based solely on early, potentially biased information. In professional settings, it's also valuable to be mindful of the order in which information is presented. For example, in negotiations or presentations, structuring the content in a way that distributes key points evenly rather than front-loading all the major arguments, can help mitigate the overbearing influence of the first impression. Similarly, training sessions and workshops can focus on teaching individuals to critically evaluate their first impressions and consider alternative viewpoints, fostering a more balanced decision-making process. In summary, the primacy effect is a powerful cognitive bias that causes us to give disproportionate weight to the information we encounter first. While this bias helps us quickly organize and make sense of new data, it can also lead to skewed judgments and poor decision-making if we fail to consider subsequent information fully. By recognizing the impact of the first impression and actively incorporating strategies to review and balance all available data, we can work toward more accurate, fair, and effective decision-making in both our personal and professional lives. The framing effect is a cognitive bias where the way information is presented, its frame, significantly influences our decisions and judgments, often independent of the actual facts. In essence, the same set of data can lead to entirely different conclusions simply by altering its wording or context. For example, if a medical treatment is described as having a 90% survival rate, people tend to view it much more favorably than if it is described as having a 10% mortality rate, even though the statistics are identical. This phenomenon occurs because the frame in which information is delivered highlights certain aspects while downplaying others, shaping our perception in a powerful way. Our brains are naturally inclined to process information efficiently by relying on mental shortcuts, and the frame of a message provides a cue for how to interpret that information. When information is presented in a positive light, our focus is drawn to potential benefits. Conversely, a negative frame draws attention to risks and drawbacks. This can lead to decisions that might not be based on the full scope of facts, but rather on the emotional resonance or salience of the framing. In everyday life, the framing effect influences everything from consumer choices to political opinions, subtly steering our behavior by tapping into our emotions and cognitive predispositions. The impact of the framing effect extends into various domains. In business, marketing strategies often use framing to make products seem more appealing. Advertising might emphasize gains, such as save 20%, rather than losses, like don't miss out on missing 20% savings. In political discourse, the way policies are framed can dramatically alter public support. A policy described as protecting jobs is more likely to be accepted than one described as increasing government spending, even if both describe the same initiative. In legal contexts, the framing of evidence or testimony can influence judgments and verdicts, as the narrative presented often shapes how the information is ultimately interpreted. This bias is also evident in interpersonal relationships. When we form first impressions, the way someone presents themselves or their story can set a tone that colors all subsequent interactions. For example, if a person shares their past in a way that emphasizes their resilience and successes, we may be more inclined to overlook minor faults or mistakes. On the flip side, a single negative detail mentioned at the outset can overshadow later, more balanced information. This skew in perception shows just how powerful the initial frame can be in shaping our overall view. One of the challenges with the framing effect is that it often operates below our conscious awareness. We might not realize that our decision is being swayed by the way a question is asked or how a message is worded. This subtle influence means that even well-intentioned, rational individuals can be led to make decisions that don't fully align with the underlying reality. The effect underscores the importance of looking beyond surface-level presentations and critically examining the core data and context. To mitigate the influence of the framing effect, it is essential to cultivate an awareness of how information is presented. One practical strategy is to deliberately reframe information from multiple perspectives. For instance, if evaluating a healthcare decision, consider both the positive and negative statistics to gain a fuller understanding of the risks and benefits. This balanced approach forces you to look at the data objectively rather than being swayed by emotionally charged language. Another strategy is to seek out diverse sources and viewpoints. By exposing yourself to multiple presentations of the same information, you can compare how different frames might lead to different conclusions and adjust your thinking accordingly. This not only helps in reducing the impact of any single frame, but also encourages a more holistic evaluation of the available evidence. In addition, practicing critical thinking techniques such as questioning assumptions and asking clarifying questions can further help to counteract the framing effect. For example, when a decision is presented to you, take a moment to ask, what information might be missing here? Is there another way to look at this data? Such reflective questioning can uncover biases that might otherwise go unnoticed. In summary, the framing effect is a pervasive cognitive bias that causes us to be influenced by the way information is presented rather than by the information itself. By emphasizing certain details and downplaying others, a frame can dramatically alter our perceptions, decisions, and judgments. While this bias helps us quickly process complex information, it can also lead us astray if we rely solely on the initial presentation. Through awareness, deliberate reframing, seeking multiple perspectives, and applying critical thinking, we can reduce the impact of the framing effect and make more balanced, informed decisions in both our personal and professional lives. The overconfidence bias is a common cognitive error that leads us to overestimate our own abilities, knowledge, or control over events, often resulting in decisions that don't align with reality. When we're overly confident, we may dismiss risks or ignore the possibility of failure because we believe that our judgments are infallible. This bias can manifest in various aspects of life, from personal endeavors and academic pursuits to business strategies and financial investments, and it can have significant consequences. At its core, overconfidence stems from our natural desire to feel secure and capable. When we succeed at something, our minds reinforce the belief that our skills or decisions were the key factors behind that success. This reinforcement can create a positive feedback loop where each success makes us even more certain of our abilities. However, this certainty often comes at a cost. By overestimating our own competence, we tend to underestimate challenges and overlook potential pitfalls. For instance, a student might believe that they grasp a subject completely after a few correct answers, and as a result, they might not study as thoroughly as needed, which can lead to unexpected difficulties during exams. In professional settings, the overconfidence bias can lead to risky decisions. Business leaders might initiate ambitious projects or investments without fully accounting for uncertainties or alternative outcomes. This overestimation of their own insight may cause them to ignore critical data, rely too heavily on gut feelings, and even underestimate the competition. The result is often a series of costly mistakes or projects that run over budget and time. Similarly, in the world of finance, investors might be so confident in their predictions that they fail to diversify their portfolios, leaving them vulnerable when markets do not behave as expected. One of the more subtle impacts of the overconfidence bias is on our interpersonal interactions. When we are overly certain of our opinions or judgments, we might discount the perspectives or advice of others. This can lead to an echo chamber effect, where only our views are validated and dissenting opinions are ignored. Over time, this not only hampers personal growth, but can also lead to conflicts in teamwork, as collaboration requires openness to different ideas and approaches. In this way, overconfidence can stifle innovation and reduce the overall effectiveness of group decision-making. The psychological mechanisms behind overconfidence are multifaceted. Part of it involves our memory system. When we recall past successes, we often neglect to remember our failures or the times when things didn't go as planned. This selective recall reinforces the belief that we are better at certain tasks than we actually are. Moreover, social factors play a role. In cultures that emphasize individual achievement and self-reliance, the pressure to appear competent and in control can amplify our natural tendency toward overconfidence. The need to maintain a positive self-image encourages us to focus on our strengths and downplay our weaknesses. While some degree of confidence is beneficial, it can boost our motivation and help us tackle challenges. The overconfidence bias becomes problematic when it leads us to make decisions without fully considering the risks or uncertainties. For example, an entrepreneur might launch a new venture with little market research, relying solely on their conviction that their idea is revolutionary. When unexpected challenges arise, the entrepreneur's overconfidence can hinder adaptability and resilience, leading to potential failure. So, how can we mitigate the overconfidence bias? One effective approach is to actively seek out and consider disconfirming evidence. Before making a decision, take the time to critically evaluate your assumptions and ask yourself what might go wrong. Gathering data, consulting with others, and examining past experiences can provide a more balanced perspective. It can be helpful to maintain a decision journal where you record your predictions and the reasoning behind them. Reviewing these records later allows you to compare your expectations with the actual outcomes and learn from any discrepancies. Another strategy is to practice humility in decision-making. Recognize that no matter how much experience or success you've had, there are always factors beyond your control. By acknowledging uncertainty, you open the door to more adaptive and flexible planning. Embracing a mindset that values continuous learning over the certainty of one's own judgment can reduce the impact of overconfidence. Additionally, seeking external perspectives is crucial. Engage in discussions with colleagues, mentors, or peers who can provide constructive feedback and challenge your assumptions. This not only broadens your viewpoint, but also helps to uncover blind spots that you might have missed. In collaborative environments, structured decision-making processes, such as group brainstorming sessions or devil's advocate approaches, can help balance individual overconfidence with collective wisdom. In summary, the overconfidence bias causes us to overestimate our abilities and control, leading to overly optimistic decisions that often overlook risks and uncertainties. While confidence is important for motivation and achievement, unchecked overconfidence can result in poor planning, increased risk-taking, and potential failure. By actively seeking disconfirming evidence, embracing humility, keeping track of our past predictions, and inviting external feedback, we can counteract this bias, ultimately cultivating a more realistic view of our capabilities and the inherent uncertainties of life leads to better decision-making and more sustainable success in both personal and professional domains. The Dunning-Kruger effect is a cognitive phenomenon where people with lower ability in a particular domain tend to overestimate their competence, while those with higher ability often underestimate their skills. It essentially describes a gap between actual competence and perceived competence, a gap that can lead to overconfidence among the less skilled and self-doubt among the more skilled. Imagine someone who is new to public speaking. At first, they may feel that their first few attempts were excellent because they aren't aware of all the nuances and complexities involved in delivering an effective presentation. They might not realize the extent of their mistakes, such as unclear articulation or lack of engaging content. This lack of awareness about their own shortcomings leads them to overrate their abilities. Conversely, experienced speakers who have honed their skills over time are more likely to be aware of subtle errors and the challenges of effective communication. As a result, they often rate themselves more critically, even when they are performing very well. One key factor behind this effect is a deficiency in metacognitive skills, that is, the ability to evaluate one's own performance accurately. People who lack sufficient expertise in a domain are not only less skilled at performing tasks, but also less skilled at recognizing their errors. They miss the cues that would normally alert someone with more knowledge to the gaps in their understanding. Because they don't know what they don't know, they end up overestimating their competence. This effect has broad implications. In academic settings, for example, students who are less proficient in a subject might assume they have a better grasp of the material than they actually do, which can lead them to put in less effort and ultimately perform poorly. In contrast, students who are more skilled might underestimate their abilities, possibly leading to lower self-confidence despite strong performance. The same pattern can be observed in the workplace, where an employee might overestimate their ability to manage a project or solve a complex problem, leading to poor decision-making and, in some cases, significant errors that could have been avoided with a more accurate self-assessment. Moreover, the Dunning-Kruger effect isn't just limited to personal abilities, it also influences how we evaluate others. We might assume that a colleague who seems overly confident is exceptionally competent, when in fact, their self-assuredness may be a result of not fully understanding the complexities of the task at hand. This misjudgment can lead to an environment where overconfident individuals are rewarded, while those who are more competent but modest about their skills are overlooked. Understanding the Dunning-Kruger effect is crucial because it reminds us that expertise and self-awareness often go hand in hand. As we gain experience and knowledge in a particular area, our ability to evaluate our own performance tends to improve. In other words, the more we learn, the more we realize there is still much to learn. This process can sometimes lead to what's known as imposter syndrome among highly skilled individuals who might underestimate their competence even as they excel. So, how can we counteract the Dunning-Kruger effect? One effective approach is to seek constructive feedback. When you're unsure about your performance, asking for opinions from peers, mentors, or experts can provide an external perspective that might reveal blind spots in your self-assessment. Regular feedback not only helps correct overconfidence, but also promotes continuous learning and improvement. Another strategy is to adopt a mindset of lifelong learning. Recognize that every expert was once a beginner, and that developing true competence takes time and effort. By acknowledging that you might not have all the answers, you open yourself up to learning from mistakes and from the insights of others. This attitude fosters humility and encourages a more accurate appraisal of your skills over time. It also helps to engage in reflective practices, such as keeping a journal or periodically reviewing your performance on specific tasks. By documenting your progress and comparing your initial self-assessments with actual outcomes, you can begin to calibrate your expectations more accurately. Over time, this habit can lead to more realistic self-evaluation and better decision-making. In summary, the Dunning-Kruger effect illustrates how a lack of self-awareness in a given domain can lead individuals to overestimate their abilities, while those with greater expertise tend to be more critical of themselves. This cognitive bias can have far-reaching consequences in academic, professional, and social contexts, affecting how decisions are made and how others are evaluated. By seeking external feedback, committing to continuous learning, and engaging in regular self-reflection, we can mitigate the effects of this bias, leading to a more balanced and accurate understanding of our own capabilities.